Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a contradiction that burns more than the chemical itself. A weapon that the world agreed was too painful for soldiers, yet somehow acceptable for civilians standing in their own streets. Tear gas has always lived in a strange space between law, fear, and convenience, and its history is filled with clever marketing, political loopholes, and a surprising amount of scientific improvisation. So before you get too cozy, take a second to gently tap that new hype button YouTube just added. It really does help little guys like me push through the algorithm. And be sure to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now, get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we will drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. You open the file expecting something simple, maybe a tidy definition with gentle scientific language. Instead, you end up staring at a list of chemicals that sound like they were named during a late-night dare at a laboratory. You read the first one, and your brain immediately supplies an image of a scientist in goggles whispering, "Trust me, it is fine." While everyone else edges slowly toward the exit, you keep going anyway, because curiosity is a stubborn creature, even when your eyes start to widen at phrases like chlorobenzyl and malonitrile. You repeat them quietly to yourself, and the syllables feel like they should come with a warning label, or at least a free coupon for a lung exam. The strange part is the tone in which these ingredients are often described. You skim through official documents that talk about them with the calm energy of someone explaining how to fold a napkin, as if these harsh particles are just quirky little air fresheners that happen to cause coughing, crying, and temporary existential reflection. You picture a polite scientist saying, "It irritates the mucous membranes," as though that is a normal Tuesday activity, something you schedule between watering your plants and answering emails. Your nose tingles just reading about it, even though there is no real reason for it to do so, and you begin to suspect your imagination might be more reactive to fumes than your lungs. You move to the next description and find cheerful phrases about how tear gas is really a riot control agent, which sounds like something invented by someone who desperately wanted to avoid the phrase chemical that makes people feel like their entire face is staging a dramatic protest. You reread the ingredient list, and even though you know this is not a cooking recipe, your brain still tries to figure out what ratio these things are mixed in, and this leads to a horrifying mental image of a cauldron, bubbling with spicy misery. You wonder who the first person was to test it, and whether they were paid extra or simply volunteered in a moment of poor judgment. The deeper you read, the stranger it becomes. You find out that tear gas is not actually a gas, not in the sense your brain always imagined. It is often a powdered chemical that becomes airborne when heated or dispersed, which means you have essentially been picturing the wrong villain this entire time. Instead of a sleek cloud moving with cinematic flair, it is more like glitter that has been weaponized. Once it is in the air, it clings to your skin, your clothes, your eyelashes, and probably your will to live. You blink at the screen and suddenly understand why so many people describe the experience as less like walking through a mist and more like being hugged aggressively by a spice cabinet. You pause to consider the fact that this substance is banned in war, but somehow widely used in civilian settings. The ingredient list alone feels like enough to disqualify it from birthday parties, let alone city streets. You imagine reading this same list to someone from another century and watching their eyes widen until they resemble startled dinner plates. You also imagine reading it to someone extremely calm and scientifically trained, someone who nods and says, "Yes, that is the one that causes intense burning sensations," in the same tone one might use to mention that a sweater pills easily. As you examine how the chemical behaves, you find testimonies describing sensations like being unable to open your eyes, unable to breathe normally, unable to think clearly. People compare it to slicing onions inside a sauna while someone shakes pepper flakes in your direction. You find yourself involuntarily squinting at the text, as though the very idea is trying to waft into your face. You shift in your chair, rub your nose, and check the air around you, even though you know you are being dramatic. Still, the ingredient list has already planted itself firmly in your imagination, and now your imagination is staging its own interpretive dance of discomfort. You reach the bottom of the description and discover one final detail that somehow makes the whole thing even stranger. Tear gas affects everyone slightly differently, depending on humidity, temperature, wind, and pure luck. This means the same chemical can feel mildly unpleasant to one person and absolutely catastrophic to someone standing a few feet away. You picture a field test where half the participants cough politely, while the other half rethink their entire lives. The ingredient list does not mention this chaos directly, but it lingers between the lines, like a footnote written by someone who wanted to be honest, but also did not want to ruin the brochure. By the time you close the file, your eyes feel suspiciously watery, your throat feels dry, and your mind feels like it has entered a long corridor filled with warning signs. You knew tear gas was unpleasant, but reading the ingredients brings a new kind of awareness, the kind that makes you blink slowly and wonder how something so small can cause such a dramatic reaction. You shut the screen gently, as if not disturbing the information might somehow keep it from leaping out into the room, and you sit there for a moment, letting the strange, stinging story settle in your thoughts. You drop into the trenches with the uneasy feeling that mud is about to become a personality trait. The ground sucks at your boots. The air smells like cold metal and old fear. And somewhere in the distance, someone is yelling at someone else about a missing shovel. You can hear artillery thumping far enough away to pretend it is not aimed at you, but close enough that your body disagrees. You duck automatically, even though nothing is exploding nearby, because everyone here seems to duck on instinct, the same way people flinch when someone drops a glass in a quiet room. Then you notice the scientists. They do not quite belong here, and you can tell because they are the only people in this entire muddy world who still have clipped notebooks, neat pens, and the kind of hopeful enthusiasm usually found in people who have not yet tested their invention on anyone. One of them balances a canister the size of a lunch tin, turning it in his hands like he is admiring a rare gemstone instead of something that will soon be launched into the atmosphere with questionable wisdom. Another nudges his glasses up while explaining particle behavior to a soldier who clearly just wants breakfast. They speak with the bright energy of people who have spent too much time indoors thinking about chemistry and not enough time outdoors experiencing consequences. You inch closer because curiosity refuses to let you stay put. One scientist beams at you, delighted to have a new audience, and he launches into a cheerful explanation of their newest creation. He says it is meant to incapacitate the enemy without blowing them up, which sounds almost noble until he describes how it works. He uses phrases like a controlled irritation, a momentary disruption of the senses, and a brilliant tactical advantage, all while the soldier next to him eyes the canister as though it might bite. You nod along even though half the terms feel like they were invented on the spot, the verbal equivalent of stirring soup and hoping it tastes good. You are invited to look more closely at the prototype, and you immediately wish you had not. It is warm to the touch because of some heating mechanism inside, and the metal casing has that faint chemical smell that suggests it would like to be handled by someone wearing thicker gloves. The scientist insists it is perfectly safe right now, which is exactly the kind of sentence that produces instant distrust. You hold it gingerly, as if the wrong gesture might cause the entire trench to vanish in a puff of spicy air. The FA scientists are thrilled because they believe they have finally found a way to influence battles without leaving piles of shattered equipment behind. They talk about strategy, efficiency, and battlefield psychology, all while ignoring the part where soldiers will soon be inhaling whatever is inside that canister. You listen as they debate the perfect moment to deploy it, arguing about wind direction and humidity with the same intensity people usually reserve for family recipes. You get the sense that they genuinely believe they are helping, that this irritating little cloud is somehow more humane simply because it is not made of shrapnel. When they request volunteers for a demonstration, everyone suddenly becomes deeply occupied with imaginary tasks. Some soldiers begin adjusting boots that were perfectly fine seconds earlier. Others inspect mud as though it contains answers to life. The scientists remain oblivious to the collective panic, scribbling notes about airflow and calculating distances with the zeal of children planning a science fair volcano. You step back a little because you like your eyes functioning, and you are not eager to experience science this personally. The canister is placed on the ground while the scientists scurry behind a makeshift barrier, which feels like an ominous choice. They signal for someone to activate it, and a hesitant soldier taps the ignition like he is waking a sleeping dragon. There is a brief hiss, followed by a puff that looks harmless enough until it begins spreading in a slow, creeping wave. The scientists watch with wide, shining eyes, whispering things like fascinating and excellent dispersion, while everyone else instinctively covers their faces and tries to pretend the breeze is on their side. You watch the irritating cloud expand, drifting with a lazy confidence that suggests it is already quite pleased with itself. Even from a distance, your eyes sting lightly, as if the air wants to remind you who is in charge now. The soldiers curse in increasingly creative ways, stumbling backward while blinking furiously. The scientists jot down notes about tear production with the unflappable calm of people observing a sunset. You wonder if any of them have actually breathed this stuff in, or if they simply assume discomfort is a myth. As the trial ends and the mist thins, the scientists gather around with celebratory energy, delighted that the soldiers are not permanently damaged and thoroughly impressed by their own invention. They congratulate one another, debating minor tweaks while ignoring the wheezing happening nearby. You stand there in the fading haze, absorbing the sight of brilliant minds who have convinced themselves that making people temporarily miserable is, in fact, a step forward for humanity. You are not sure whether to admire their confidence or question their judgment, so you settle into the familiar trench mud and simply watch them talk. The faint chemical bite still lingering on your tongue. You stand at the edge of the trench as the mist rolls in, and for a moment everyone stares at it with the confused curiosity of people watching a very small, very ominous weather event. It looks harmless enough. A drifting pale cloud swirling low to the ground, but the soldiers brace anyway. They always brace. The air shifts, the breeze tilts, and the mist reaches the first unlucky group like an overeager handshake. The reaction is instant. One soldier blinks once, twice, then his entire face contorts as if someone has replaced his eyeballs with hot coals. Another coughs so violently you half expect a lung to leap out and request its own transfer. A third tries to shout something heroic, but ends up producing a noise best described as a goose having a crisis. You watch all of this unfold in a chain reaction that rises and falls through the trench, and it is painfully clear that whatever the scientists predicted, this is not it. The scientists had described a mild irritant, something that would encourage retreat without causing lasting harm. But the soldiers seem to be moving in every direction except a coordinated one. Some stumble backward, others forward. One climbs halfway up a dirt wall before sliding down like a particularly unlucky sack of potatoes. A man attempts to remove the irritation by fanning the air with his helmet, an effort that is approximately as useful as trying to fight a thunderstorm with a napkin. A few try to maintain dignity, straightening their posture and squinting defiantly into the sting, but even they fold within seconds. You watch their faces move through the entire emotional spectrum: confusion, denial, outrage, acceptance, and finally the full-body staggering that comes with intense sensory betrayal. The mist spreads unevenly, catching some with a direct hit and others at the edge, but the chaos is universal. Everywhere you look, there is coughing, blinking, shouting, and an impressive variety of improvised hand signals that convey messages like, I cannot see, I cannot breathe, and I would like to go home now." One soldier attempts to guide another out of the fog, but since both are equally disoriented, they walk directly into a wooden post. They bounce off it like startled beetles, apologize to each other for reasons unclear, and then wander in opposite directions. The scientist who assured you earlier that everything was safe takes notes, as though he is studying butterflies rather than grown men actively questioning their life choices. He writes quickly, occasionally muttering comments like "fascinating dispersion pattern," while a soldier nearby wheezes dramatically into the dirt. The oddest part is how varied the reactions are. One man coughs so hard, he folds in half like a closing pocket knife. Another cannot stop blinking, his lashes fluttering rapidly as though he is trying to create a breeze with sheer determination. A third stands completely still for a heartbeat, before letting out a sound that can only be described as the audio version of panic. You watch all this with the uneasy realization that the irritating cloud is not a neat, predictable mechanism, but more like an unpredictable prankster that reacts differently to every single person it touches. The scientists exchange satisfied looks, unaware that their definition of success and the soldier's definition differ by an entire universe. They had imagined something orderly, something controllable, maybe even something elegant in its efficiency. What they got instead is a living diagram of human misery swirling in every direction. You stand in the middle of it all, the sting faint around you, enough to make your eyes water slightly, and you begin to understand why no one truly anticipated this level of chaos. It is not the intensity alone, it is the way it scrambles instincts, overwhelms senses, and turns trained soldiers into confused, stumbling figures navigating an invisible hurricane. The cloud drifts on, fading slowly, leaving behind watery eyes, aching lungs, bruised pride, and the quiet realization that whatever this substance was meant to be, it is already rewriting the rules of combat in ways no one seems ready for. The scientists smile, the soldiers glare, and you, caught between the two, finally understand that this invention has only just begun to reveal the trouble it can make. You first notice the shift in mood when the breeze changes direction. It is subtle at first, a lazy gust rolling through the trenches like it has nowhere special to be, but the scientists freeze mid-conversation, and the nearest commander narrows his eyes at the drifting haze with the suspicion of a man who has seen far too many things go wrong already. The cloud hesitates above the no man's land, almost polite, then turns casually and floats straight toward the people who launched it. The commanders stare in silence for a long, painful moment. You can see the exact second the realization hits them, because their expressions move from confidence to concern to full internal screaming without a single word spoken. One of them mutters something about wind predictions. Another flips through his notes as if checking a weather chart he definitely did not bring, and a third just stares at the cloud like it personally insulted his family. The mist keeps drifting closer, swirling with the smug energy of a problem that knows no one has planned for this. The first commander tries to shout instructions, but the wind throws his voice back in his face, along with a faint sting that makes him cough mid-sentence. He gestures wildly, waving his arms in patterns that mean absolutely nothing to anyone except maybe a bird passing overhead. The soldiers glance at him, confused, trying to interpret whether they are supposed to run, duck, or simply hope the gas decides to move elsewhere out of pity. Another commander insists everyone stay calm, which is an impressive suggestion, given that his eyes are already watering, and he is blinking like someone trapped in a room filled with onion enthusiasts. He takes a bold step forward, attempting to maintain authority, but stumbles back as the cloud hits the trench wall, curls downward, and slips inside like an uninvited guest who knows the layout of the house better than the host. The mist reaches the first row of officers, and all composure immediately dissolves. One commander drops his clipboard, which bounces off the mud and vanishes entirely, swallowed by the trench like it has decided to retire there permanently. Another turns in a circle, coughing loudly, trying to find a patch of air that does not burn, only to discover the cloud is very committed to being everywhere at once. A third shouts an order so incoherent it might as well be a bedtime story, and the nearest soldier glances at you as if asking whether any of this is part of the plan. It is not. You try to step back from the thickening haze, but the entire command area is now a frantic mix of boots slipping, helmets clanking, and officers attempting to flee with the urgency of startled chickens. One man grabs a map and tries to use it as a fan, only to realize that blowing tear gas around does not make it less tear gassy. Another tries to retreat into a dugout, but 3 others have already squeezed into it and slammed the door like they are hiding from a ghost instead of a chemical reaction. The scientists observe all this with expressions that range from horrified fascination to mild, "this will be useful data" excitement. One takes notes while holding his sleeve over his mouth, scribbling frantically as 2 commanders collide behind him, bounce apart, and stumble in opposite directions like badly choreographed dancers. You catch the faint sound of someone shouting that this was not supposed to happen, followed by another voice yelling that the wind was supposed to be predictable. The wind, apparently, disagrees. You feel the sting in your own eyes now. It is sharp but manageable, though the panic around you elevates it to something far more dramatic. Tears gather even when you blink slowly, and the air tastes sharp, like you have inhaled a handful of pepper and a questionable life decision at the same time. Commanders cough, sputter, and attempt to regain authority, but the gas is not impressed. It swirls through their ranks with the leisurely confidence of a visiting dignitary, pausing just long enough to ensure everyone understands who is truly in charge at the moment. By the time the cloud finally thins, the scene looks like the aftermath of a very confusing parade. Commanders lean against trench walls, blinking furiously. Scientists confer in hushed voices, pretending they expected this. Soldiers exchange looks that say everything they are too polite to say out loud. You wipe your eyes with the back of your hand and stare at the dissipating haze, understanding fully now that in war, even the weapons with instructions can turn around and remind you they have a mind of their own. You sit in a drafty conference room that smells faintly of ink, wool coats, and whatever diplomats eat when they pretend not to eat. The tables are lined with polished folders, quills, and teacups that look far too delicate for the topic at hand. You expect tension, and you get it. But you also get something stranger. The barely controlled chaos of people who all think they understand chemistry, but absolutely do not want to admit that they do not. Everyone has arrived to decide what counts as a chemical weapon, and judging by the frantic shuffling of papers, no one planned to agree on anything today. The first diplomat clears his throat with the authority of a man who wants to set the tone. He declares that any substance designed to harm people should be banned, unless the harm is very temporary, very mild, or very inconvenient for the enemy in some strategic way. The room considers this. Several dignitaries nod as though this makes perfect sense, while others squint at him like he just suggested banning spoons because they can be used aggressively. You watch a second diplomat raise her hand and politely ask what temporary harm means. The first diplomat responds with a definition so vague it could apply to anything from pepper to existential dread. Another representative stands, insisting that chemical weapons must only refer to substances intended to kill. He gestures confidently, as if he has solved the issue with one sweeping motion. Unfortunately, the next delegate immediately counters that harm is harm, and that if something makes people choke, cry, or feel like they have been kicked in the lungs by an invisible mule, it should probably qualify. You watch several diplomats exchange looks that say they wish they had chosen a different profession, ideally one involving fewer arguments about invisible mules. Someone mentions tear gas, and the room goes still. Not silent, just still in that particular way. People freeze when they realize they have wandered into a complicated topic. The representatives lean forward, sensing an argument that will require diagrams, emotional stamina, and possibly snacks. One diplomat claims tear gas is perfectly safe because everyone recovers quickly. Another counters that safe is a questionable word for something that makes people loudly reconsider their life choices. You sit between them, listening to both sides, while a note-taker beside you scribbles furiously as though writing the world's most stressful cookbook. A chemist is brought in to clarify matters, which turns out to be a mistake. He begins explaining molecular structures with deep enthusiasm, sketching diagrams that look like lopsided snowflakes. And within minutes, half the room pretends to understand, while the other half openly gives up. You watch a diplomat from across the table lean toward his colleague and whisper that the chemist might be speaking a different language entirely. The chemist continues undeterred, describing lacrimatory agents, while everyone else nods with the blank politeness of people who definitely should have asked more questions earlier. The discussion spirals. One delegate insists that tear gas should be allowed because it encourages compliance without causing fatalities, which sounds suspiciously like someone describing a very aggressive babysitting technique. Another warns that allowing it for civilians but banning it in war makes no moral sense whatsoever. The room erupts into overlapping arguments, each voice climbing higher, each explanation becoming more convoluted. You swear one diplomat begins drawing a flowchart that only leads to more flowcharts. A moderator tries to restore order by tapping a small gavel, but the sound is completely drowned out by diplomats energetically disagreeing in multiple languages. Papers flutter. Someone knocks over a cup. A delegate from the back stands and loudly asks whether anyone even knows what a chemical weapon is at this point. No one answers, possibly because no one wants to commit to a definition that will be quoted in tomorrow's newspapers. Finally, after an exhausting parade of debates, metaphors, and half-baked scientific analogies, the diplomats begin drafting a treaty. The language is careful, polished, and intentionally vague in the spots where everyone failed to agree. Chemical weapons are banned, mainly the lethal ones, and tear gas lands uncomfortably in a gray area no one is satisfied with, but everyone is too tired to revisit. You watch them sign the document with stiff spines and slightly defeated expressions, as if they have spent the entire day chasing a cat that keeps leaping onto new furniture. When the meeting adjourns, you step outside into fresh air, feeling the cool breeze wash over you. After hours of hearing arguments swirl like storm clouds, the quiet feels like a truce. It is clear the world has agreed to ban chemical weapons, but it is also clear that no one is entirely sure what chemical weapon means. And somehow, that contradiction is going to linger much longer than the ink drying on the treaty. You take your seat in a long hall that hums with the anxious politeness only diplomats can produce. Sunlight filters through tall windows, casting polite rectangles of light across polished tables stacked with documents that have been revised so many times the paper looks tired. Every delegate sits with the posture of someone determined to look calm, even though half of them have been arguing for days, and the other half look prepared to start again the moment someone clears their throat. The topic is chemical warfare, and tear gas has drifted its way into the conversation like an uninvited guest who refuses to leave. You listen as the first representative stands and speaks with a solemn weight that makes the room lean in. He describes the horrors of the trenches, the choking, fogs, the way soldiers clawed at their own faces when chemical clouds enveloped them. You can almost smell the memory of those battlefields in his voice. He ends by saying that war already has more than enough misery without adding the sting of a weapon designed to scramble every human sense at once. The room murmurs in agreement, the kind of sound that suggests a rare moment of shared human decency. Another nation's spokesperson rises, this one clutching a stack of notes she never actually looks at. She speaks about international reputation, moral responsibility, and the unsettling idea of a world where armies casually unleash fumes meant to overwhelm the human body. She gestures once toward a diagram of chemical agents, and then decides against explaining it, perhaps realizing that no one here needs to revisit molecules that bring grown soldiers to their knees. Her point is simple. If humanity is going to pretend it has rules for war, then surely those rules should include banning clouds that make people cry, choke, and stumble blindly across battlefields. The hall grows warmer as more delegates stand to add their voices. Some speak quietly, describing the way tear gas spreads unpredictably. Others speak with rising emotion, insisting that even non-lethal suffering is still suffering. A few diplomatically avoid mentioning that their own militaries experimented with these substances, focusing instead on how deeply they now oppose them. You watch the dance of political phrasing, carefully constructed sentences drifting across the room like fragile strings trying to tie nations into agreement. Then comes the moment everyone knew was coming. A delegate from a powerful nation suggests making an exception for controlled temporary agents. He says it gently, with the tone of someone offering a compromise, but the room stiffens. Temporary harm, he argues, is preferable to permanent injury. Why ban something that incapacitates without killing? Around him, chairs shift, pens tap, and you can feel a collective inhale as other nations prepare to pounce on the loophole forming before their eyes. They do not disappoint. A representative from across the hall stands and declares that controlled suffering is still suffering, and that allowing tear gas in war would open the door to larger, more painful temptations. Another points out that battlefield conditions are never controlled, that wind does not read treaties, and that clouds drift wherever they please. Someone at the far end mutters loudly enough for you to hear that soldiers do not need more creative ways to panic. The room erupts into layered debate, passionate but strangely respectful, as though each nation understands that this decision will shape the future of warfare. You listen as the arguments rise and fall, each one peeling away another layer of justification. Eventually, the resistance crumbles. Even the hesitant nations begin nodding, persuaded by testimony, moral pressure, or the simple awareness that history is watching. Bit by bit, the room gathers around a shared conclusion. Tear gas is too cruel for war. The wording is formal, the signatures precise, but beneath the legal phrasing lies something surprisingly human. A collective admission that some weapons twist the nature of conflict in ways too visceral to justify. You watch the agreement finalize, ink drying on pages that will guide future generations, and for a brief moment, the hall feels lighter. The delegates stand, stretching stiff limbs, exchanging cautious smiles. Outside, the air is crisp and clean, untouched by any kind of manufactured sting. As you step into the quiet breeze, you cannot help but feel the weight of what you have witnessed. A rare moment when nations, despite everything, chose to draw a line not for strategy, but for mercy. You first meet the marketers in an office that smells faintly of cigar smoke, ambition, and paper that has been handled by too many optimistic hands. The war has ended, but these men are already thinking several steps into the future, like chess players who only play matches where they always win. They sit around a polished table, sleeves rolled up, eyes bright, studying a canister of tear gas the way jewelers study diamonds. You stand behind them and feel the uneasy thrill of watching people who truly believe they have discovered an untapped niche in the misery industry. One of them taps the canister with the confidence of a man introducing a new brand of toothpaste. He says it works beautifully on soldiers, which means it will surely appeal to police departments, prison wardens, border agents, and anyone else who has ever had to deal with a crowd that refuses to obey. Another marketer leans in, nodding so enthusiastically his chair squeaks. He says the real selling point is not the pain, but the image of control. A neat, modern solution, clean and temporary, and therefore marketable to anyone anxious about unrest. You watch them speak with such bright enthusiasm that you begin to wonder if they have ever inhaled this stuff themselves, or if they simply assume discomfort only happens to other people. They pull out promotional sketches that show tear gas as a kind of benevolent fog, gently encouraging crowds to disperse. There are no red faces, no coughing fits, no panic, just orderly movement tidy lines of citizens drifting away as though following polite suggestions. The marketers smile proudly, as if they have personally invented peace. You know, the reality is much messier, but here, in this room, the truth does not stand a chance against the power of good lighting and assertive salesmanship. One man stands and begins pacing, describing possible slogans. He wants something authoritative but comforting, firm yet friendly. He tries a few phrases out loud, each one worse than the last, until another marketer excitedly waves a hand and suggests branding it as a humane alternative. The entire room lights up. Humane. A word that can soften almost anything, especially when spoken with enough confidence. You watch them test it repeatedly, rolling it around like a shiny coin. Humane deterrent, humane control, humane response. With enough repetition, the word begins to lose all meaning, turning into an abstract sound floating above the table. The room fills with energy. A chalkboard appears, covered in doodles of police officers, city streets, and strangely cheerful crowds. The marketers talk about profit margins, global demand, and the ripe opportunity of a new century that wants modern tools to handle modern problems. None of them mention the stinging eyes, the choking throats, the way people scatter when the gas blooms. Instead, they talk about efficiency and order, as though they are offering housekeeping services instead of chemical discomfort in pressurized metal casing. You follow them on a train as they bring samples to various officials, each presentation delivered with the enthusiasm of someone unveiling a new household appliance. They talk about safety protocols, quick recovery, and predictable results, even though you know unpredictable is the only truly accurate word. The officials nod along, persuaded by charts, diagrams, and the promise of a painless solution to complicated social issues. They sign orders, shake hands, and express relief that someone has found an answer. The marketers celebrate quietly, in their smooth, professional way. A few raise glasses and toast the future, convinced they have offered the world a tool of modern civility. None of them seem to notice the irony, or if they do, they politely ignore it. You watch them pack their demonstration kits with the calm satisfaction of men who believe they have solved something, even though all they have really done is repackage a battlefield irritant into a product with polished brochures and a slogan people can repeat without wincing. Outside, the late afternoon light softens the street. Carriages roll by. Conversations drift through open windows. Life moves at a peaceful pace. Yet the canisters in the marketers' briefcases carry the same sting as those used in war, now dressed in the language of progress. You walk alongside them, aware that the world is about to discover this new invention, not through the chaos of trenches, but through the calm persuasion of people who saw a business opportunity in pain and decided to run with it. You watch the transformation begin in a quiet office decorated with potted plants that are definitely fake and posters that promise a brighter, safer future. The marketers sit with their sleeves rolled up, preparing to turn a substance born in muddy trenches into something that can be politely offered to city officials without anyone raising an eyebrow. A chalkboard displays two columns. On one side sits the phrase, "Battlefield Irritant," underlined 3 times. On the other side, someone has written "Civilian Crowd Management" in swooping handwriting that suggests optimism or denial. The group studies these words like they are examining 2 different species that happen to share the same bones. A man with carefully combed hair picks up a canister and says they need to change the story, not the product. He suggests starting with language. Instead of describing tear gas as a chemical that sends people scrambling in watery panic, they can paint it as a measured, modern solution. You watch him flip through pamphlet drafts that swap out grim warnings for soothing lines like temporary discomfort and rapid recovery. He reads them aloud in a cheerful tone, ignoring the fact that the gas itself has never sounded cheerful in its life. Another marketer proposes adding a diagram, something clean and scientific, showing how the mist disperses. He wants arrows, gradients, maybe even silhouettes of crowds peacefully parting like polite theater-goers leaving their seats. He draws a sketch with such enthusiasm that he almost makes you believe no one will cough, stumble, or rethink their entire worldview once the gas deploys. Everyone nods at the drawing with the satisfaction of people who have found the perfect way to hide reality behind attractive graphic design. The rebranding efforts intensify. They test new names, each one softer than the last. Irritant becomes agent, agent becomes deterrent, deterrent becomes compliance tool. You feel a small part of your brain question whether words can actually soften molecules, but the marketers seem convinced the right vocabulary can reshape the entire concept. A few suggest emphasizing how the gas is non-lethal, repeating the phrase until it stretches across the room like a protective dome. Non-lethal quickly becomes the centerpiece of every pitch, the shining badge of moral reassurance. Weeks later, you accompany them to meetings with city officials who have seen enough public demonstrations to be open to new methods. The marketers smile warmly, place their polished brochures on the table, and describe tear gas as the perfect blend of control and compassion. They talk about safety, efficiency, and order, carefully avoiding any mention of the chaos you saw on the battlefield. You watch the officials skim the pamphlets, occasionally pausing at the clean diagrams and soothing terminology. It is astonishing how easily people accept a weapon when it is dressed in polite vocabulary and printed on glossy paper. One official asks whether this gas is the same type used in war. The marketers exchange a knowing look, the kind reserved for rehearsed questions. They explain that it is indeed related, but in a harmless civilian form, like a cousin who only visits on holidays and never overstays. They reassure him that international agreements forbid its use in battle precisely because it is too humane for soldiers. The logic bends in every direction, yet somehow lands softly enough for the officials to nod along. Soon, the rebranded canisters roll off factory lines with new labels, no longer packaged like ominous wartime tools, but more like practical devices for keeping things calm. You follow the marketers as they showcase these updated products at conventions, placing them beside uniforms and radios as if they are longtime members of the public safety family. They speak proudly about innovation, highlighting tear gas as a civilized alternative to harsher measures, neatly glossing over the part where civilians will still experience burning eyes and collapsing lungs for several minutes. You watch the shift take hold across newspapers, training manuals, and government memos. Tear gas becomes a phrase softened by repetition, something that blends into the background of civic order. It floats out of the shadow of warfare and into the routines of cities, carried forward by people who believe they have found a gentler path. You stand at the edge of this transformation and feel a strange mixture of disbelief and inevitability. With enough marketing gloss and strategic vocabulary, even a battlefield menace can reinvent itself as a tidy, practical tool for managing crowds. And the world, eager for simple solutions, accepts the new version of the story without lingering too long on the old one. You find yourself wandering through a bustling municipal expo where city officials move from booth to booth with the eager energy of people convinced they are about to solve every public safety problem in one afternoon. Bright banners hang from the ceiling, promising innovation, efficiency, and something described as community-forward solutions. In the center of it all sits a polished display of tear gas canisters, arranged with the same care someone might use when arranging fruit in a decorative bowl. Officials approach the table with shining eyes, and you realize very quickly they are about to buy these devices. With the same impulsive enthusiasm people use when buying home decor they absolutely do not need. A representative from one city picks up a canister and weighs it in his hand, like he is imagining where it will look best, possibly next to the new radio system or near the freshly painted riot shield rack. He nods approvingly, while the salesperson explains features with cheerful precision, emphasizing ease of use and modern design. You watch the official's face brighten with every sentence, and it becomes painfully clear that he has already mentally placed a bulk order. He sets the canister down gently, the same way someone handles a throw pillow they know will complete the couch. Another official from a neighboring city approaches with the brisk excitement of someone who heard there might be free samples. She asks whether the tear gas comes in different dispersal options, the same tone people use when asking whether a lamp comes in several colors. The salesperson beams and rattles off options like he has been waiting all morning for this question. Wide spread, narrow spread, slow burn, fast release. The official claps her hands softly, delighted by this menu of discomfort, and you begin to suspect she will approve the purchase before she even returns to her office. As the expo continues, you witness one city after another lining up to place orders. Some ask thoughtful questions about training and safety, but most treat it like a routine upgrade, as if tear gas is simply another tool for modern urban living. You hear phrases like strategic asset and essential addition spoken with the same casual enthusiasm normally reserved for new landscaping equipment. Every time an order form is signed, the salesperson scribbles notes with joyful efficiency, eyes sparkling in a way that makes you slightly uneasy. You follow a group of officials into a demonstration area where a presenter explains deployment techniques with upbeat confidence. They nod along, impressed by the neatness of the procedure, never mind the swirling cloud of imaginary fumes he is gesturing toward. One city planner whispers to another that this tool could really streamline things, as if they are discussing a filing system rather than something known to make people instantaneously reconsider all their choices. The presenter finishes with a flourish, and the audience applauds, already convinced that this purchase represents progress. Later, in quieter corners of the expo, you overhear conversations that confirm exactly how eager cities are to buy. One mayor boasts that her city will be ahead of the curve, like someone bragging about owning the newest kitchen gadget. A police chief explains that even if they do not need tear gas now, it is always good to have on hand. You picture storage rooms across the country, slowly filling with neatly stacked canisters, each one waiting for a moment no one hopes to see, but everyone has prepared for with startling enthusiasm. The sales team barely keeps up with the demand. Forms are passed back and forth, pens glide across lines, and agreements are sealed with firm handshakes. You watch this entire process unfold with the surreal sense that the cities are purchasing not a chemical irritant, but a trendy solution advertised in glossy magazines. It is buying for the sake of readiness, buying because other cities are buying because the marketing is irresistible. By the time evening settles in, the expo floor is littered with empty coffee cups and satisfied smiles. City representatives leave with pamphlets tucked under their arms and purchase orders tucked in their folders, walking with the purposeful confidence of people who believe they have invested in safety. You remain behind for a moment, taking in the lingering smell of polished flooring and paperwork. The display of canisters gleams under soft lights, looking almost decorative in their carefully arranged formation. It is in that moment you realize just how easily fear, convenience, and persuasive marketing can combine into enthusiasm, and how quickly enthusiasm becomes adoption, even when the product in question is a cloud that burns, blinds, and sends crowds scattering like startled birds. You arrive at a training ground on the edge of the city where the morning air still feels crisp enough to make everyone believe the day might go smoothly. A line of police officers stands in formation, boots polished, uniforms stiff, faces carrying that cautious optimism usually reserved for new equipment that has not yet betrayed them. They eye the tear gas canisters laid out on a folding table as though they are looking at exotic fruit, unsure whether it is meant to be eaten, admired, or avoided entirely. A captain with a clipboard clears his throat and announces that today they will practice crowd control with this exciting new technology, and you can practically hear the universe chuckling. The first demonstration begins with a lecture. A cheerful instructor explains how tear gas will encourage crowds to disperse in a calm, orderly fashion. He speaks like a man who has only ever seen drawings of crowds, not actual groups of humans reacting to discomfort. He demonstrates the proper throwing technique, emphasizing wrist movement as if he is teaching a cooking class. The officers nod, taking notes with the seriousness of students preparing for a major exam. You stand back and watch the optimism bloom a little too brightly for what you know is coming. When the instructor finally ignites the first canister, the officers lean forward with interest. The device hisses softly, releasing a thin plume that twirls upward like steam from a kettle. Everyone murmurs approvingly. The captain looks particularly pleased, perhaps imagining future situations where this clean, tidy cloud encourages perfect compliance. Then the wind shifts, not dramatically, just enough to nudge the gas toward the officers instead of the imaginary crowd they are practicing on. The reaction is immediate and stunningly ungraceful. One officer coughs once, then folds at the waist like a puppet losing its strings. Another tries to back away but trips over a colleague's boots, turning the formation into a tangle of limbs. Someone attempts to shout orders, but the only sound that comes out is a strangled squeak. The instructor waves his arms and shouts to stay calm, but he is blinking so rapidly that his words wobble in and out of coherence. You watch as once proud, straight-backed officers stagger around like they are trying to find a door in a room that does not have one. A few of them attempt to tough it out, standing still with their eyes squeezed shut and their jaws clenched. These officers hold firm for roughly a second before the burning sensation sweeps across them like a very enthusiastic greeting. One lets out a noise that suggests he might be reconsidering every decision that led him to this training ground. Another fans the air frantically, even though everyone has already learned that fanning does not help, not even a little. A third officer runs in a large circle, presumably trying to escape the cloud, only to return to the exact same spot like a confused homing pigeon. The captain tries to restore order, yelling instructions through watery eyes, but his words dissolve into coughing fits until he gives up entirely and waves the group toward open space. Officers stumble past each other, bumping shoulders, apologizing between coughs, blinking so hard you worry they might squeeze their eyes straight out. Someone drops their baton. Someone else accidentally kicks it across the dirt. The instructor kneels in the grass, scribbling furiously in his notebook as though this chaos is valuable scientific data. When the air finally clears and everyone regains the ability to breathe without sounding like they are auditioning for a tragic opera, the captain gathers the group for a debrief. He tries to maintain authority, but his red eyes and the tear tracks still shining on his cheeks undermine the effect. He politely insists that the demonstration was useful, even though half the officers look ready to pack their things and transfer to a department that deals exclusively with lost property. The instructor assures them that with practice, deployment will become smooth and controlled. The officers nod again, but this time the nodding is reluctant, cautious, the nodding of people who have learned that nothing about this tool will behave as politely as the brochures promised. You stand at the edge of the field, watching the group disperse, each officer walking with the slightly disoriented steps of someone who just survived a surprise sensory event. The training ground settles into quiet. A few canisters lie on their sides, innocent and motionless now, giving no hint of the chaos they unleashed. You take one last look at the scuffed dirt, the watery-eyed officers, and the stubborn optimism lingering in the air. It is clear that tear gas may have a place in policing, but smooth demonstrations will never be part of its personality. You stand in a bustling newsroom where typewriters chatter like caffeinated insects, and reporters weave between desks, carrying stacks of paper that look one spilled coffee away from disaster. The air buzzes with urgency, the kind that makes everyone walk slightly faster than necessary. At the center of the room sits a long desk piled with headlines in progress, and perched above it is a chalkboard labeled Community Safety Innovations. You immediately spot the words tear gas positioned proudly between articles about local sports and a suspiciously enthusiastic review of a new pastry shop. A reporter with ink-stained fingers flips through notes and declares that tear gas is the future. He says this with the same conviction someone might use when announcing a groundbreaking medical discovery, not a chemical that makes perfect strangers cry with dramatic intensity. He taps on his typewriter, muttering phrases like revolutionary crowd control and gentle yet effective, all while shoving crumbs from his midday snack off the keyboard. You watch him craft a paragraph that reads almost like an advertisement, describing tear gas as a modern miracle that will bring order to chaotic streets. At the next desk, another reporter is writing a lifestyle column. She tastes a new honey-glazed pastry, pauses thoughtfully, and then casually pivots into explaining how cities are adopting tear gas to maintain public peace. She describes it as a smart civic investment, right alongside her recommendation for a bakery that sells rolls the size of a toddler's head. The transition is so smooth you blink twice to make sure you did not hallucinate it. She continues typing, unbothered, as though tear gas naturally belongs between flaky pastries and weekend event calendars. You drift toward the editorial meeting where decisions about tomorrow's headlines are being made. Editors sit in a semicircle, each one armed with a pencil and a sense of self-importance. They discuss which stories will sell papers, which ones will reassure the public, and which ones might make readers feel warm and informed. Tear gas ends up categorized under public reassurance, spoken about in the same comfortable tone as fire hydrant upgrades or shorter lines at the post office. One editor suggests a headline calling it a humane solution, while another suggests adding a small illustration to keep things approachable. Someone jokes about including a coupon for bakery treats, and the room erupts in the kind of laughter only very tired people can produce. By the afternoon edition, the newspaper is already rolling through the presses. You watch the giant machines devour blank sheets and spit out printed pages in rapid, rhythmic motion. On the front page, just under a cheerful story about an upcoming fair, sits an article praising tear gas as a breakthrough tool for keeping cities safe. The layout is so neatly arranged that the unsettling nature of the topic almost disappears. Readers scanning the page will encounter it. Between an interview with a local gardener and a glowing review of the bakery that appears to be sponsoring half the newspaper's enthusiasm, you follow a stack of freshly printed papers to a street vendor who sells them near a busy corner. People grab copies on their way to work, flipping through casually, nibbling on breakfast snacks as they skim over stories. You watch one man read the tear gas article with mild interest, nodding thoughtfully before turning the page to check the crossword. Another reader enthusiastically circles the bakery recommendation, but barely notices the part describing the chemical agent designed to make crowds scatter in discomfort. The paper has tucked tear gas into the everyday rhythm of city life so neatly that no one blinks. As evening settles, you reread the articles and realize how effortlessly the newspapers have normalized something fundamentally chaotic. They present tear gas as a tidy, dependable tool, a modern fix for messy human behavior, nestled among recipes, advertisements, and cheerful community updates. It is not that the editors intend to mislead anyone. They simply package the world the way they think readers want to see it, orderly, optimistic, and always accompanied by snack suggestions. You close the paper slowly, feeling the strange disconnect settle in your chest. War has barely ended, yet the very tool that panicked soldiers and coughing officers now appears in print next to glowing descriptions of cinnamon swirls. It is clear that tear gas has been handed a new identity, not a weapon, not a hazard, but a convenient solution perfectly sized for a column on page 3. You find yourself in a factory office where everything smells faintly of ink, floor polish, and the kind of optimism companies produce in bulk. The walls are lined with posters showing friendly diagrams of chemical dispersal, each one softened with pastel colors that make the whole thing look more like an educational brochure for spring allergies than a product designed to overwhelm the human body. A group of manufacturers sits around a long wooden table, reviewing a stack of pamphlets that have just come from the printing press. They flip through the pages with the proud enthusiasm of parents admiring school portraits. One of them taps a page that features an illustration of a peaceful city street with smiling officers and citizens strolling past each other like extras in a musical. The tear gas canister on the page practically glows, positioned as a symbol of community harmony rather than a device that sends people scrambling into alleys. He nods at the picture and says the artwork strikes the perfect balance between approachable and authoritative. Another manufacturer agrees, insisting that any mention of burning sensations should be tucked discreetly into the final section, wrapped in comforting language about temporary effects. You watch as they debate fonts. One wants something bold to imply reliability. Another prefers something softer to convey care. They eventually compromise on a style that looks like it belongs on packaging for herbal tea. They claim it will ease public concerns, though you suspect it has far more to do with avoiding any hint of alarm. A pamphlet is lifted to the light, admired for its calming blue border and cheerful tagline. You marvel at how much effort has gone into making something inherently unpleasant look like a thoughtful neighborhood upgrade. The manufacturers shift to discussing testimonials. They exchange drafts of short quotes attributed to officials describing tear gas as efficient, controlled, and humane. You can tell some of the statements have been edited until they barely resemble human speech. One quote reads like it was written by someone juggling enthusiasm with vague discomfort, yet it is still deemed perfect for page 4. Another testimonial describes tear gas as a helpful tool for maintaining order during community events, which is not the most accurate phrasing, but it fits the tone of the pamphlet so neatly no one questions it. When the topic turns to distribution, the manufacturers brighten. They plan to place pamphlets in police stations, libraries, and civic buildings, tucked between flyers for recycling programs and notices about upcoming festivals. The idea is to make tear gas feel normal, something woven into everyday civic life. One man suggests including a tiny coupon for a discounted training seminar, the kind of detail that somehow makes the entire situation feel even stranger. You can practically see the public flipping through these pamphlets while waiting in line to renew their licenses, absorbing carefully crafted sentences that transform a chemical irritant into a symbol of responsible governance. They conduct a mock presentation, practicing how to introduce the pamphlets at city meetings. The lead presenter uses a gentle voice, as if delivering bedtime stories to mildly anxious bureaucrats. He highlights key phrases like minimal risk and reliable dispersion pattern, giving each one a reassuring smile. The rest of the group nods along, occasionally suggesting tweaks to soften the message even further. You stand at the back of the room and realize that every word is engineered to soothe, every illustration designed to distract, every sentence polished until it feels more like an invitation than a warning. By the time the meeting ends, the pamphlets are neatly stacked into boxes, ready for distribution. You watch workers load them onto a cart, their expressions calm and unaware of the oddity of the moment. The boxes are labeled in friendly handwriting, as if they contain crafts rather than descriptions of a tool created to overwhelm the senses. As they roll away, the manufacturers gather their notes with the quiet pride of people who believe they have done something helpful. Outside, the afternoon sun glints off the windows, bathing everything in warm light. You picture countless hands picking up these pamphlets, casually flipping through pages that have been shaped to guide their opinions without the slightest hint of pressure. The friendliness of the design hides the true purpose, wrapping discomfort in soft colors and gentle phrasing. And as you walk away, you cannot shake the feeling that these little booklets are not simply informing the public, but gently nudging them, smoothing over concerns one pastel diagram at a time, until the line between weapon and tool begins to blur just enough to slip by unnoticed. You begin your travels in a crowded customs hall, where officials stamp documents with the rhythmic confidence of people who have not actually read anything they are approving. A stack of crates, labeled with vague, comforting phrases like civic safety devices, waits on a wooden pallet. You stand nearby as workers roll them into a loading bay destined for a ship already heavy with other boxes carrying similar euphemisms. The labels avoid any mention of sting, choke, or overwhelming sensory chaos, instead favoring phrases that suggest calm evenings and orderly sidewalks. It feels less like a shipment of chemical agents and more like an order of decorative lanterns for a garden festival. When the vessel reaches the next country, you watch officials greet the cargo with unearned enthusiasm. They open the crate, glance inside, and immediately begin nodding as if they have confirmed everything they already believed. A representative skims a pamphlet, catches the words humane, deterrent, and closes it with the satisfaction of someone who considers reading the first sentence equivalent to understanding the entire topic. Before the crate is even unloaded, the country has mentally added tear gas to its roster of modern tools, driven entirely by the assumption that if another nation is using it, it must be both safe and sensible. As you follow the product into government buildings, you see how quickly imitation replaces investigation. In one capital city, an official waves a brochure from another nation like a permission slip. He insists that these devices must be effective because other countries use them confidently. His peers nod, convinced that widespread adoption is proof enough, even though none of them has actually seen the gas deployed. They flip through diagrams that leave out the more dramatic details and admire illustrations that carefully avoid showing anyone coughing or stumbling. Someone suggests placing a trial order. Someone else suggests skipping the trial entirely. The room tilts toward excitement. You cross another border and find yourself in a security ministry filled with polished desks and officials who speak in brisk, authoritative tones. Here, the decision-making seems even more circular. One official cites a neighboring country's glowing summary of tear gas as justification for adopting it. Another quotes a translated article from a newspaper that itself was quoting a pamphlet written by the very manufacturer who sold it in the first place. The entire chain of information resembles a snake happily biting its own tail, except the snake is filing paperwork and approving budgets. Sometimes you catch glimpses of skepticism, usually from someone who has read too many technical reports and knows that no chemical agent behaves as politely as the brochures claim. But skepticism does not stand a chance when its opponent is the powerful pull of international conformity. If 10 nations have adopted tear gas without incident, then the 11th surely believes it must follow or risk looking outdated. You watch the reasoning unfold in real time, a parade of logic so flimsy you could fold it into an origami crane. As tear gas crosses continents, its reputation grows stranger and more self-reinforcing. Countries adopt it simply because other countries have adopted it. Officials cite one another's decisions like a chain of increasingly confident echoes. You hear phrases such as widely accepted and globally proven tossed around in meetings where no one has ever seen a single proper data sheet. By the time the product reaches its 4th or 5th stop, the narrative has been polished smooth. Tear gas is not just a tool. It is a sign of modernity, responsibility, and forward-thinking governance. All because no one paused long enough to ask whether any of the glowing claims have ever been tested outside of a sales pitch. You trail the crates into a warehouse that smells of cardboard and new equipment. Workers stack the boxes alongside riot shields and hand radios, unaware that the decision to purchase these canisters was based on a chain of unchecked optimism stretching across continents. As they climb ladders and seal inventory logs, you realize that tear gas has achieved something remarkable. It has reinvented itself, not through evidence, but through momentum, carried from nation to nation on a breeze of assumption. When you step outside, evening light spills across the street. Somewhere nearby, a government office is already discussing its next procurement order. The pattern continues, each country trusting the one before it, none of them stopping to ask the simplest questions. And you cannot help but feel you are watching the world adopt a chemical irritant the same way people adopt fashion trends, swept along by confidence, repetition, and the comforting belief that if everyone else is doing it, it must be perfectly fine. You step onto the grounds of a police training academy just as the morning sun stretches across a field dotted with eager recruits. The air carries the hopeful scent of fresh-cut grass and the faint tang of disinfectant. the combination apparently meant to convince everyone that today will be productive and orderly. Instructors stride around with the cheerful energy of camp counselors on the first day of summer, arms swinging, whistles bouncing, faces alight with enthusiasm that feels just a little too energetic for what they are about to introduce. You fall into the rhythm of the place, watching recruits stretch, adjust their uniforms, and grin nervously at one another. A lead instructor gathers them in a semicircle and begins with an upbeat speech about teamwork, resilience, and practical skills. His tone fits perfectly with wilderness hikes and trust fall exercises, not chemical irritants. He paces back and forth like someone preparing to announce a game involving water balloons, but instead he gestures dramatically toward a table stacked with tear gas canisters. The recruits lean in, expecting a serious lecture. Instead, the instructor claps his hands and says they are lucky because today they get to experience real-world conditions. His smile is so bright you half expect him to offer matching t-shirts. Another instructor jumps in, explaining tear gas deployment with the same chipper cadence someone might use to teach knot tying. He talks about dispersal patterns, safety, protocols, and wind awareness, throwing in jokes as though the group needs to be entertained. The recruits laugh dutifully. A few raise their hands to ask questions, and the instructors answer them with rehearsed enthusiasm that never once wavers. You get the distinct impression that these men could sell the whole experience as a team bonding exercise if given enough coffee. The first demonstration starts with a dramatic countdown that makes the recruits straighten with anticipation. The instructor pulls the pin on a canister and lofts it through the air with such flair that you briefly imagine applause. The device clinks against the ground and begins hissing, releasing a pale cloud that billows outward. For a moment, everyone observes silently, impressed by how controlled it looks. Then the wind shifts, ever faithful in its mischief, and the cloud drifts toward the recruits. You brace yourself. The first recruit coughs, bending at the waist like someone who inhaled a lungful of pepper. Another blinks rapidly, trying to balance bravery with biology, and failing instantly. The cloud catches the rest of the group with unceremonious efficiency, scattering them backward in a flurry of watery eyes, stumbling feet, and choked attempts at stoicism. A few recruits try to tough it out, standing rigid with their hands on their belts, but the gas does not care about posture. It wraps around them, swirling into their faces no matter how bravely they squint. The instructors shout through the cloud, their upbeat tones now wobbling into hoarse encouragement. They gesture wildly, urging recruits not to panic while coughing hard enough to disrupt their own instructions. The scene resembles a chaotic outdoor play where half the cast has forgotten their lines and the other half is trying not to cry. One recruit trips over his own boot, stumbles into another, and they both careen into a third who had just started to recover. Another blindly waves his arms, as though battling invisible bees. Someone loses their cap and immediately tries to retrieve it despite being nearly unable to see. The instructors do their best to restore order, but every attempt at guidance dissolves into more coughing fits and frantic gestures. When the cloud finally clears, the recruits stand gasping, blinking, and sniffling with the shaky relief of people who have just survived something much more dramatic than advertised. The instructors herd them into a loose formation and try to revive the chipper atmosphere, though their own red eyes make the effort look slightly unhinged. They congratulate the recruits for their resilience, insist the experience will make them stronger, and remind everyone that next time will go much smoother. You watch the group nod, still dazed, some wearing expressions that drift between pride and mild horror. The instructors return to the table of canisters with fresh enthusiasm, already preparing for the next drill as if nothing at all unusual has. The sun climbs higher, warming the field. The academy settles back into its rhythm, energetic and determined, unaware of how absurdly cheerful it looked while introducing a device that has never belonged anywhere near a summer camp atmosphere. You arrive in a hospital conference room where the fluorescent lights flicker just slightly, giving everything the faint ambience of a place where important warnings come to be politely dismissed. A group of doctors sits around a long table, covered in medical journals and half-finished cups of bitter coffee. Their expressions range from concerned to deeply concerned, the kind of looks worn by people who have spent entire careers trying to keep lungs functioning and eyes unburned. They shuffle charts and diagrams, showing the effects of tear gas on human tissue, speaking in quiet, precise voices that carry the weight of experience. One doctor taps a chart that displays a collection of symptoms in tidy columns. He explains how tear gas can inflame airways, trigger asthma attacks, and linger on clothing and surfaces longer than anyone wants to admit. The others nod, adding anecdotes from the emergency rooms where they have treated people who wandered into drifting clouds or who were simply unlucky enough to live near where the canister landed. Their conversation grows more animated as they compare notes, the kind of grim enthusiasm that only emerges when professionals realize they have all been seeing the same troubling patterns. Another doctor, a woman with a calm voice and an impressive ability to maintain composure while delivering unpleasant truths, flips open a folder and points to research gathered from military archives. She explains that even low doses can disrupt breathing, irritate skin for hours, and create long-term complications for anyone with underlying conditions. She mentions that children react differently, as do the elderly, and that the gas does not politely avoid those who never signed up to be near it. Her tone is measured, steady, and scientifically grounded. But as you listen, you begin to sense the futility lurking underneath. They compile their findings into a neat, respectful report meant for government officials. It is logical, thorough, and written with the kind of clarity doctors hope will persuade people who make decisions. As they finish assembling the final pages, a few of them allow themselves cautious optimism. Surely, they say, once officials see the data, someone will slow things down, or at least reconsider the enthusiasm with which tear gas has been adopted. They seal the envelope with a crisp snap, unaware of the quiet journey their warning is about to take. You accompany them to a public safety meeting where they present their findings in person. The room is filled with officials who smile politely, adjusting their ties and checking their watches with subtle impatience. The doctors speak with conviction, detailing the respiratory risks, the unpredictable nature of wind, the possibility of long-term harm. They show graphs, photographs, and case studies. At one point, the calm-voiced doctor mentions that several nations have documented significant medical concerns. Another doctor describes a patient who spent hours coughing violently after a brief exposure. When they finish, the room goes still for a heartbeat. You wait for questions, for follow-up, for anyone to show even a flicker of alarm. Instead, an official clears his throat, thanks them for their time, and immediately pivots to discussing procurement costs. Another mentions that other cities have been using tear gas with no reported problems, which you recognize as code for "we did not check." Someone else suggests that the concerns, while interesting, should not distract from the need to maintain public order. Their voices are pleasant enough, but the dismissal is swift, practiced, and complete. The doctors sit quietly, realizing they have just been filed away mentally in the same category as unsolicited discount offers. Outside the building, the doctors cluster together on the steps, their faces heavy with frustration but not surprise. They talk about writing letters, submitting papers, trying again, because that is what doctors do. They try even when no one listens. You watch them disperse into the evening, their coats billowing slightly in the wind, carrying their warnings with them like fragile parcels no one wants to open. The city around you moves on, bustling with noise and motion, unaware of the concerns that were raised and then swept aside in the space of a single meeting. For a moment, you imagine the envelope sitting in a stack somewhere, buried under paperwork that will be skimmed too quickly to matter, and you realize just how easily expert warnings can vanish, not with argument or debate, but with the simple efficiency of polite indifference. You find yourself in a quiet laboratory, where the walls hum softly with the sound of machinery doing its best to behave. The air smells faintly of antiseptic and paper, the kind used for clipboards and meticulous charts. Scientists in white coats move around you with the focused seriousness of people who know exactly how many milligrams of every substance they are handling. They gather around a large table covered with data sheets, petri dishes, and an alarming number of diagrams depicting lungs that look increasingly distressed with every new illustration. One researcher adjusts his glasses and taps a page filled with neat columns of test results. He explains that they have been exposing controlled subjects to tear gas concentrations far lower than what police use on crowds. Even so, the findings are unsettling. Increased inflammation, aggravated asthma, prolonged coughing, and something politely labeled airway irritation that reads more like the lungs are attempting to file a formal complaint. He speaks gently, perhaps hoping to soften the implications, but the numbers do not care. About tone. Another scientist, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern, flips through a binder containing medical evaluations from volunteers who admittedly look more enthusiastic on paper than they did during the actual experiment. She points out that even brief exposure triggers measurable changes in breathing patterns. Some participants develop chest tightness. Others struggled to fully inhale for hours afterward. A few describe the sensation as breathing through a wet towel. She marks each detail with a colored pencil, creating a rainbow of discomfort that stretches across the page. You step closer to a microscope where two interns are studying tissue samples. They whisper about cell reactivity and chemical residues, the same way students whisper about ghosts in a dorm hallway. One of them nudges a diagram toward you. It shows epithelial cells that should look smooth and orderly, but instead appear swollen and irritated, as if they too have opinions about being exposed to tear gas. The interns shake their heads and scribble notes with the grave enthusiasm of people who now understand far more than they wanted to. As the scientists compile their findings, the room feels heavier. Charts stack up, each one confirming the same pattern. Tear gas does not simply make people cry and stumble. It lingers in the lungs, scratches at airways, and leaves the body struggling long after the cloud has faded. One researcher suggests that maybe authorities should reconsider calling this stuff harmless. Another adds that harmless tools generally do not cause symptoms that mimic respiratory infections. A third quietly wonders whether anyone in government will actually read the report or simply skim the summary and thank them for their time. They gather around a long chalkboard to discuss publishing their findings. The conversation drifts between cautious optimism and scientific resignation. They speak in calm, measured tones, but you can hear the unease beneath every word. If their data is correct, and it certainly appears to be, then tear gas is not the clean, temporary irritant the pamphlets promised. It is something that leaves a mark, subtle enough to overlook in a chaotic moment, but unmistakable when examined under a microscope. The lead researcher writes potential long-term respiratory impact on the board. The chalk squeaks, leaving flakes on the floor like tiny white warnings. He circles the phrase once, then again, as if hoping repetition will make the point undeniable. Around the table, heads nod slowly. They have seen enough. They know what the data means, even if they are not sure anyone outside this room will want to acknowledge it. When the report is finally assembled, it is thorough, cautious, and supported by every piece of evidence the team could gather. They bind it in a slim folder, neat and professional, then place it on a desk where it glows faintly in the afternoon light. For a moment, the scientists allow themselves to hope. After all, facts are facts. Surely the implications will matter to someone. As you leave the lab, the air outside feels strangely clean. You inhale deeply, aware of the quiet privilege of breathing without irritation. Behind you, the scientists return to their work, preparing to share findings that gently suggest what should already be obvious. Making people choke is not, in fact, ideal for their lungs. You stand at the back of a government press room where the chairs are arranged too neatly, as if tidiness alone might convince everyone that the situation is perfectly under control. Officials bustle around with folders tucked under their arms, straightening ties, smoothing hair, and rehearsing reassuring phrases under their breath. A podium waits at the front, flanked by flags that ripple slightly in the stale air conditioning. The atmosphere carries the unmistakable scent of confidence that has not yet met evidence. A spokesperson steps up first, smiling with the polished brightness of someone who practices smiling in the mirror. She begins by thanking everyone for coming, her voice warm and steady, the tone people use when delivering calming bedtime stories. She flips open her notes and launches into a speech about public trust, consistent standards, and the importance of maintaining order. Then, with the smoothness of a magician revealing a dove, she announces that tear gas has been thoroughly evaluated and deemed perfectly safe for civilian use. Her smile widens as though she expects applause. A few reporters shift in their seats, flipping through scientific studies that say otherwise, but the spokesperson is already drifting into her next point. She insists that the gas is temporary, that the discomfort fades quickly, and that any alarming reports have been exaggerated by misunderstandings, coincidences, or possibly the weather. She waves one hand lightly, as if brushing away inconvenient facts like dust on a windowsill. You watch the room nod along, some reluctantly, others gratefully, absorbing her certainty as if it were a warm blanket. A second official approaches the podium. He speaks with the booming confidence of a man who has never inhaled tear gas, but absolutely believes he understands its behavior. He repeats phrases like minimal risk and proven track record, stacking them carefully like building blocks meant to construct a fortress of reassurance. When a reporter asks about studies showing lung irritation, he chuckles politely and says those studies reflect extreme scenarios. When another asks about vulnerable populations, he replies that guidelines exist to ensure everyone remains safe, as though guidelines have ever stopped wind from blowing wherever it chooses. Behind him, aides shuffle diagrams depicting neat clouds drifting harmlessly through the air. The diagrams look more like weather forecast graphics than representations of something that makes people drop to their knees. One aide steps forward to explain that tear gas is designed to promote compliance without lasting harm. His tone so mild that you half expect him to offer cookies afterward. He points to arrows and color-coded puffs, confident that visual clarity will smooth over any doubts. You glance around the room. Some officials whisper to their colleagues, nodding with the practiced rhythm of people who have already decided what they want to believe. Others avoid eye contact with the reporters, focusing on their paperwork as though it contains the answers they do not wish to say aloud. A reporter raises a hand and asks why tear gas is banned in war. The spokesperson responds with a smile so quick it almost looks rehearsed. She explains that battlefield conditions are unpredictable, but civilian settings are controlled and supervised, the verbal equivalent of assuring someone that up is down if you just squint hard enough. The press conference moves on. More officials take turns at the podium, each one offering slightly different flavors of reassurance. One emphasizes tradition, insisting these tools have been used for years with no issues. Another highlights cost effectiveness, which feels like an odd angle for a discussion about inhaling chemicals. A third praises international cooperation, conveniently neglecting to mention that most countries adopted tear gas because someone else did first. By the time the final speaker concludes, the room is filled with a soft haze of certainty, the kind that settles over people when they are told exactly what they want to hear. Officials gather their papers and exit with confident strides, leaving behind the faint echo of well-polished phrases that answered everything without addressing anything. Outside, you watch them step into waiting cars, their expressions calm and satisfied. The sun glints off the windows, warm and indifferent. For a moment you stand still, listening to the muffled hum of the city around you. It becomes clear that governments do not need to dismiss concerns loudly. They only need to speak smoothly, smile steadily, and insist that everything is fine. And remarkably, that often works. You are standing at the edge of a wide city street just as evening begins to settle, the sky glowing with that soft, deceptive light that makes everything look calmer than it actually is. People gather for a peaceful demonstration, milling about with signs tucked under their arms and conversations drifting through the warm air. Families mingle with students. A man near you hands out bottles of water. The mood feels almost festive, like a block party built on shared purpose. You remember the brochures that described crowds as predictable shapes that politely move wherever the arrows on the diagram pointed. You already know this scene is going to prove otherwise. A row of officers forms at one end of the street, their uniforms sharp and their posture crisp. They speak into radios, shifting slightly, as though waiting for a cue in a performance none of them actually rehearsed. Then a canister clinks onto the pavement. It rolls once, twice, then pops open with a hiss that slices through the noise like a warning whispered too late. A pale cloud spills out, and you feel the tension snap through the crowd. The first cough comes from a teenager standing near a lamppost. It is sharp and startled, the kind of sound someone makes when they swallow water the wrong way. Then the cloud thickens, sneaking through the air with unsettling familiarity, and suddenly the crowd becomes a living diagram of chaos. People who were standing calmly a moment ago are rubbing their eyes, stumbling backward, covering their faces with shirts, scarves, whatever fabric they can find. The air shifts again, carrying the gas farther than anyone expected. You hear someone shout that they cannot see. Another voice cracks as they call for their friend. Someone drops a sign and steps on it by accident while trying to find their bearings. A mother grabs her, the daughter's wrist, and pulls her toward the edge of the street, weaving through people with frantic determination. The girl cries loudly, her small hands pressed to her face. You watch their silhouettes blur in the fog, moving with the erratic desperation the brochures never mentioned. Nearby, an older man collapses onto his knees, coughing so violently you feel the force of each breath in your own chest. A stranger drags him upright and guides him toward clearer air, both moving in a crooked line that has nothing in common with the tidy arrows on promotional diagrams. Your eyes sting even from a distance. Every blink forces out fresh tears you did not intend to shed. You cover your nose and mouth with your sleeve, but the gas slips through anyway, finding its way into your lungs with the persistence of a rude houseguest. Around you, people bump into each other, grasping at arms, backs, shoulders. No one moves cleanly or gracefully. There is no polite dispersal, only instinct, survival, and an overwhelming urge to escape a cloud no one asked to breathe. A man tries to shout instructions, but his voice dissolves into choking. Another person stumbles into a planter and knocks it over, sending soil cascading across the sidewalk. A woman drops her bag and does not bother picking it up. Someone else rips off their glasses and wipes them on their shirt, only to smear the lenses further. Every motion is clumsy, panicked, human. The officers stand rigid behind their masks, watching through clear lenses as the crowd scatters in messy, unpredictable waves. It is not the orderly flow the brochures promised. It is a flock of startled birds in every direction at once, wings beating against invisible barriers. You realize the gulf between advertisement and reality is wider than anyone wanted to admit. Eventually the cloud thins, drifting upward and outward. The coughing softens into ragged breaths. People sit on curbs, eyes red and streaming, trying to steady themselves. Their faces carry shock, anger, confusion. Some look back at the empty canister lying on the pavement like a discarded toy that somehow caused all this. Others simply stare at the ground, waiting for their lungs to remember how to behave. You breathe slowly, feeling the rawness settle into your chest. No diagram could ever capture this. No brochure would dare include images of people clutching each other blindly, voices broken, the world reduced to sting and panic. Reality, it seems, is far less tidy than the marketing suggested. You sit in the back row of a courtroom that smells faintly of old wood, paper, and the collective uncertainty of everyone present. The walls loom high, lined with shelves of legal books thick enough to double as doorstops. Lawyers shuffle through binders, judges adjust their robes, and clerks rush about with stacks of documents that look increasingly like they are regretting their own existence. Everyone appears determined, focused, and entirely unprepared for the tangled debate they are about to enter. The case begins with a calm tone, the kind used by people who hope order will magically appear if they speak slowly enough. A lawyer steps forward, clearing his throat, and starts explaining that tear gas use in a recent incident may have crossed the line into excessive force. He cites medical records, videos, and reports, all of which describe scenes where civilians were coughing, stumbling, and desperately seeking air. He reads one line with such seriousness that even the judge leans in, as though the gravity of it might help clarify the situation. Then the opposing counsel rises, radiating an air of confidence so polished it almost shines. She insists the officers followed protocol, that the gas was used responsibly, and that temporary discomfort does not necessarily equate to excess. She gestures toward a chart depicting tear gas dispersal as a soft, controlled cloud that behaves like a polite guest at a dinner party. You glance at the chart and wonder if anyone involved has ever met an actual gas cloud. The judge asks for definitions. Excessive force, proportional response, reasonable action. Each term sounds straightforward until lawyers begin dissecting them like a classroom full of students arguing over the correct interpretation of a poem. One lawyer insists excessive means any action causing more harm than necessary. Another counters that necessary is subjective. The judge raises a hand and asks for clarity, but instead receives 3 overlapping explanations that grow increasingly tangled until they resemble knots rather than arguments. A witness takes the stand, a young man with red-rimmed eyes, who recounts how the tear gas drifted unexpectedly, affecting people nowhere near the original confrontation. His voice shakes slightly as he describes the burn in his lungs and the panic around him. The court listens dutifully, nodding, writing notes. Then the defense asks whether he was sure the discomfort lasted long enough to qualify as serious, as though measuring suffering by stopwatch is a normal thing people do. He stares blankly, trying to reconcile human experience with legal definitions that seem allergic to nuance. Next, an expert in chemical agents is called. She explains that tear gas effects vary, that wind plays tricks, that dosage is unpredictable, that people react differently. The court tries to box her answers into tidy categories. She keeps reminding them the gas refuses to behave tidily. By the end of her testimony, the judge massages his temples, perhaps wishing gases came with on-off switches, or at least clearer legal boundaries. The lawyers return to their arguments with renewed vigor. One insists the officers exercised restraint. The other argues restraint would involve not making an entire street cry simultaneously. Definitions expand, contract, overlap, and collide. What counts as excessive? Is it the number of canisters, the direction of the wind, the duration of coughing, the diameter of the cloud? At one point, someone presents a mathematical diagram that makes the entire courtroom stare as if trying to decode ancient runes. The judge attempts to summarize the discussion, but every summary raises a new question. Was the crowd actually threatening? Were safer alternatives exhausted? Was tear gas truly the least harmful option? Each query spirals into arguments that feel increasingly surreal. The court is trying to measure chaos using rulers designed for straight lines. By the time closing statements begin, the room is full of tension, scattered definitions, and the faint sense that the law is trying very hard to impose order on something fundamentally disorderly. The lawyers speak passionately. The judge listens intently. The clerks type furiously, capturing every word of confusion with unwavering dedication. When the gavel finally falls, the decision feels less like an answer and more like a temporary patch placed over a leaking roof. The court has ruled, but no one seems entirely sure whether the definitions they crafted will hold up in the next case or the one after that. As people file out, murmuring to one another, you linger for a moment, absorbing the odd weight of it all. Tear gas was built to scatter crowds, not fit neatly within courtroom vocabulary. Watching the law attempt to categorize it is like watching someone try to politely label a thunderstorm. And confusion, you realize, is not just a side effect here, it is the inevitable outcome. You find yourself standing on the edge of a park just after a long night of chaos has settled into an uneasy quiet. The grass is damp with morning dew, and the air carries the faint chemical bite left behind by the previous evening's cloud. Activists begin to drift in from every direction, bundled in jackets and scarves, carrying bags that look like they were stolen from camping stores. They kneel in the grass and on sidewalks, scanning the ground with the focus of people searching for rare artifacts. You soon realize they are hunting for tear gas canisters, and it feels a little like watching an unconventional scavenger hunt. One activist crouches near a bench and gently lifts a canister with gloved hands. It is still warm, as though it remembers the turmoil of the night before. She holds it up to the light, examining the stamped codes and manufacturing details with the quiet intensity of a collector identifying a rare coin. She calls over another activist, who pulls out a notebook and scribbles down numbers, locations, and timestamps. They treat this small, metal shell with the seriousness of archaeologists cataloging relics from a forgotten civilization. Around the park, others are gathering their own finds. Some place canisters into padded boxes lined with old towels, carefully preventing them from knocking together. A few group them on a tarp for sorting, arranging them by brand and size, their movements oddly methodical. You watch someone place a particularly scorched canister in the center like a prize, and another snaps a picture with the solemnity usually reserved for historical landmarks. Their faces carry a mix of exhaustion, determination, and a strange kind of reverence, as if the canisters represent something significant and undeniably real. A man with a backpack motions for you to follow him. He leads you to a street corner where he points out a cluster of canisters half hidden beneath fallen leaves. He explains that each piece tells a story: where it landed, how many were used, how the wind carried the gas, and how the crowd reacted. He talks the way birdwatchers talk about rare sightings, except his enthusiasm is tinged with frustration. He collects the canisters with careful hands, placing each one in a separate compartment of his bag, creating a portable museum of last night's events. Nearby, a young woman sits cross-legged on the pavement, organizing canisters by origin. She identifies them by their markings, the tiny engraved letters that hint at where they were manufactured and when. She makes notes about which cities bought which types, muttering under her breath as she connects dots no one else bothered to trace. A small crowd gathers around her, watching as she pieces together the supply chain like a detective assembling evidence. She lifts one canister with a chipped label and says it traveled farther than she ever will. Her tone is half joke, half truth, and everyone quietly absorbs the weight of it. As the morning brightens, the pile of collected shells grows. Some activists photograph them for documentation. Others lay them out onto posters or chalk-marked boards, arranging them in rows that resemble a scientific display. A few place them gently into boxes destined for community meetings, legal hearings, or art installations meant to show the public what tear gas looks like when it is not dressed up in brochures. Each canister becomes a witness, a physical reminder that something happened here, something more tangible than official statements or newspaper gloss. You watch as one activist carefully hands a canister to an older man who cradles it as though holding an odd, heavy truth. He explains that he keeps a shelf at home, lined with them, not as trophies, but as reminders that someone must pay attention. He talks quietly about how these objects carry the weight of nights filled with coughing, rushing feet, and the sting that lingers long after the gas has faded. He places the new canister gently into his bag, its metallic clink echoing with meaning. The sun climbs higher, casting long shadows across the scattered remnants of last night's confrontation. The activists finish collecting, their bags and boxes filled with dull, gray shells that once released bright, burning clouds. They gather in small groups, comparing notes, sharing stories, mapping patterns. Some hug. Some stand silently. Some stare at the ground, aware that more nights like this will come. As they disperse, the park returns to its quiet morning rhythm, but you feel the strange weight of the objects left behind in their hands. The canisters may be empty now, but the stories inside them are not. You walk into a research facility that feels both modern and slightly overwhelmed, as though the building itself understands it has been handed a problem far larger than its square footage. The hallways hum with fluorescent lights, and the floors gleam with the shine of frequent mopping. Scientists move through the space, carrying clipboards, tablets, and expressions that suggest they have been staring at data for far too many hours. You follow them into a conference room, where charts are spread across a long table, each one filled with lines, symbols, and notes that never quite align into certainty. A researcher gestures for you to sit as she flips through a stack of reports. She explains that they have been tracking people exposed to tear gas months or even years after the initial event. Some of the symptoms are expected: lingering irritation and occasional coughing. Others are stranger, less predictable, appearing and disappearing like shy ghosts. A few participants developed chronic breathing issues. Others experienced recurring inflammation that no one can fully explain. She taps the papers with a pen, the sound soft but urgent, as though trying to summon clarity from the data. Another researcher rolls over a cart full of samples and test results. He points to lung function charts that dip in places no one anticipated. He mentions statistical significance with the tone of someone who both respects the numbers and mildly distrusts them. The data refuses to form neat conclusions. Some patterns appear promising, then vanish when new variables are added. A few subjects improve rapidly, while others struggle without clear cause. Every answer opens a new set of questions, multiplying like enthusiastic rabbits. You follow the group into a lab where technicians examine blood samples under bright lights. A technician explains that they are studying markers associated with inflammation. She points to a row of vials, each labeled with codes that tell stories only she can decipher. Some samples show elevated levels that persist long after they should have faded. Others fluctuate unpredictably, leaving the researchers debating whether tear gas has lingering biochemical effects or whether the human body simply delights in being inconsistent. In another room, a researcher scrolls through imaging results. He enlarges a scan showing slight tissue changes, then shrugs with the weary honesty of someone who knows the limits of his own field. It could be long-term damage. It could be coincidence. It could be a reaction compounded by environmental factors, stress, or the simple truth that people are complicated and their lungs even more so. He zooms out, revealing a grid of scans, each one carrying its own quiet mystery. They lead. Why? You to a small meeting area where a whiteboard is covered with questions written in different colors. Does repeated exposure increase risk? Are certain people more vulnerable? Do weather conditions matter long term? Can microscopic residues linger in lung tissues? Each question ends with a question mark that feels heavier than ink should allow. A researcher stands beside the board, arms crossed, trying to string the threads together into something resembling a conclusion. She sighs softly and adds another question to the bottom of the list. Outside the lab, a group of researchers huddle around laptops, comparing notes from different cities. They discover similarities between reports from people who have never met, never marched in the same streets, never inhaled the same clouds. Persistent cough, sensitivity to cold, shortness of breath during exercise. But the patterns refuse to be consistent enough for certainty. They spread their findings out on the floor, linking them with lines of string, like detectives mapping a case that keeps rewriting itself. One researcher turns to you and admits that science prefers clean answers. Tear gas, however, does not. It dissolves into air, but lingers in bodies in ways still too subtle to fully trace. The studies continue, year after year, reaching toward conclusions that remain just out of reach. Funding comes and goes. Participants move or stop responding. New chemicals get added to canisters, complicating the picture further. As the day winds down, the researchers gather their folders and shut down their machines. They leave the whiteboard untouched, the questions still staring back at the empty room. You feel the weight of uncertainty settle in the space between your thoughts. Tear gas was supposed to be temporary, simple, predictable. Yet every study suggests the opposite, revealing shadows where clarity should have been. When you step outside, the air is clean and cool. You inhale deeply, aware of how effortless breathing is supposed to feel. Behind you, the scientists prepare to return tomorrow, ready to ask the same questions again in hopes that the answers will finally take shape. You stand inside a police department briefing room, where the fluorescent lights flicker with the faint determination of bulbs that have seen too many meetings. A whiteboard dominates the front wall, covered in arrows, circles, and phrases that look like they were written during a brainstorming session, fueled by equal parts urgency and confusion. Officers shuffle in and take their seats, leaning back in chairs that creak loudly enough to register as commentary. You sense this is only the first stop of the day. The spokesperson steps up and adjusts the microphone, offering a confident smile that feels both practiced and vaguely apologetic. She begins by describing last night's tear gas incident as a controlled operation, executed with precision and restraint. She reads from a prepared sheet, the words flowing with the calm certainty of someone narrating a cooking tutorial. According to her version, the gas was deployed only after multiple warnings. Crowds were given ample time to disperse, and the wind cooperated beautifully. You watch reporters jot down notes, some arching eyebrows in quiet skepticism. An hour later, you find yourself across town in another department's briefing room, which is nearly identical except for the coffee machine that looks more threatening than any equipment in sight. Here, a different spokesperson takes the stand. He opens with a deep sigh, stating that the gas deployment was a split-second decision made under pressure. He emphasizes the unpredictability of the crowd, the rapid escalation, the officers' concern for safety. His version paints a picture of urgency, where warnings were attempted but swallowed by the noise, and conditions on the ground forced immediate action. Reporters shift uncomfortably, their pens pausing mid-sentence as they try to reconcile the two narratives. By the afternoon, you are sitting in a third briefing room where the chairs wobble and the walls sport motivational posters that feel slightly ironic. The spokesperson here insists the gas was not tear gas at all, but rather a mild dispersal agent. He claims it was designed to encourage orderly movement, not cause discomfort. He waves a hand dismissively and suggests that any coughing or crying was likely due to dust, emotion, or perhaps the weather. You hear a quiet sigh ripple through the room. A reporter politely asks whether the canisters labeled tear gas were mislabeled. The spokesperson blinks slowly and changes the subject. You step outside into the sunlight and try to organize the swirling explanations in your mind. 3 briefings, 3 different stories. Each version gestures toward clarity but never quite reaches it. You begin to feel like someone reading 3 summaries of the same movie, written by people who may or may not have actually watched it. That evening, you attend one final press conference in a department known for its fondness for PowerPoint. A projector hums to life, displaying a series of diagrams that attempt to reconstruct the event with neat color-coded arrows. The charts suggest the crowd moved east, then north, then possibly sideways. According to the presenter, the tear gas was used only after the crowd refused to comply with instructions delivered calmly through a loudspeaker. He clicks through the slides, each one offering a different shade of certainty. Reporters glance at each other, sharing silent questions. Someone asks for video evidence of the warnings. The presenter coughs, claims technical difficulties, and moves on to a slide showing weather patterns that look suspiciously copied from a children's book. As you listen, it becomes clear that no two departments can agree on how the same cloud of gas drifted through the same street on the same night. One calls it measured. Another calls it urgent. A third calls it harmless. A fourth calls it weather-dependent. The explanations stack like mismatched puzzle pieces, each one shaped differently, none fitting together. When the final briefing ends, you watch reporters gather in the hallway, comparing notes with growing disbelief. They whisper about contradictions, missing details, and statements that dissolve under scrutiny. Some shake their heads. Others simply laugh softly, the kind of laugh people use when they have run out of logical responses. You leave the building and step into the cool night air. The street is quiet, with no lingering haze, no crowds, no echoes of chaos. Yet your mind still swirls with competing narratives, each one insisting it holds the truth. You realize that the tear gas itself may have dispersed hours ago, but the confusion remains thick in the air. And sometimes, you think, the fog of explanation lasts far longer than the gas ever does. You find yourself seated in the back of a grand conference hall where the ceiling is so high it feels like it was designed specifically to intimidate anyone who dares speak beneath it. Flags from dozens of countries line the walls, swaying slightly in the draft from the overworked ventilation system. Delegates from every corner of the world shuffle through their binders, adjusting microphones, exchanging polite greetings that carry the strained cheer of people who know this will not be simple. The room hums with anticipation, uncertainty, and the faint rustle of translation headsets being untangled. A representative from one nation opens the session by declaring that tear gas regulations must be standardized for the sake of global consistency. His voice echoes across the room with the earnest conviction of someone who has never witnessed international negotiations before. He outlines a vision of clear rules, shared definitions, and common limits. Heads nod politely, pens hover above notepads, and for a brief moment you almost believe harmony might be possible. Then a delegate from a different nation activates her microphone and gently explains that her country defines tear gas differently. She lists exceptions, subcategories, and regional adjustments, each one chipping away at the hopeful vision laid out moments before. Another representative chimes in, clarifying that while his nation agrees in principle, the specifics must remain flexible to account for cultural context. Someone from across the room presses a button to add that flexibility is acceptable as long as it does not compromise enforcement. Within 5 minutes, the word harmonize has acquired 4 contradictory definitions. The translators work tirelessly, their expressions deeply focused as they convert tangled speeches into equally tangled equivalents. You watch one translator pause mid-sentence as a delegate attempts to describe a scenario involving wind speed, crowd density, ethical thresholds, and what he calls national temperament. She blinks, sighs softly, and begins again, determined to give the confusion an accurate voice in every language. A representative from a small island nation suggests that tear gas should be banned entirely for civilian use. He speaks calmly, citing health studies and humanitarian concerns. For a moment, the hall grows quiet. Then another delegate presses her microphone button with the enthusiasm of a game show contestant and counters that banning would jeopardize public order. She insists her country relies on tear gas as a strategic tool and cannot imagine maintaining security without it. Her neighbor nods vigorously, offering an entirely different reason rooted in tradition. A third delegate adds that definitions must account for chemical composition, delivery method, and ambient humidity. The room fills with murmurs, objections, footnotes, and terms that sound official but resist clarity. You shift in your chair as the debate spreads across the tables like an unruly vine. Representatives raise placards, each one offering amendments, counter-amendments, and friendly suggestions that politely unravel the proposals already on the floor. One country wants a maximum permissible concentration. Another argues that measurement standards differ by region. A third insists that measurements are unnecessary because officers in the field can evaluate conditions by instinct. A fourth adds that instincts vary. Charts appear on screens, each one more bewildering than the last. Lines and arrows crisscross like a map drawn by someone with an urgent need to confuse their future self. Delegates lean closer, squinting at color-coded categories that seem to multiply every time someone blinks. A presenter explains the draft guidelines in elaborate detail, only for a delegate to ask whether the guidelines apply in urban areas or just rural ones. Another requests exceptions for emergencies. The presenter inhales sharply, the sound picked up by his microphone and broadcast throughout the hall. As the hours pass, the room grows warmer, the coffee grows colder, and the list of unresolved issues expands like dough left unattended. You watch delegates rub their temples, shuffle their papers, and attempt once more to craft universal rules for something that refuses to behave universally. Each country clings to its own definitions, exceptions, and special circumstances. Every attempt at unity splinters into new branches of disagreement. By late afternoon, a weary chairperson calls for a break. Delegates rise, stretching stiff limbs, still debating as they walk toward the lobby. You follow them out, feeling the strange mixture of hope, frustration, and mild disbelief that seems to hang over all international negotiations. The hall slowly empties, leaving behind binders, water bottles, and a screen still displaying the word harmonization, as if it were a destination rather than an unreachable ideal. You pause in the doorway, listening to the fading conversations. If harmony is music, you think, then these rules are a room full of instruments, all playing different songs at the same time. You follow a group of reporters into a cramped newsroom that buzzes with the uneven rhythm of ringing phones, clacking keyboards, and coffee mugs being refilled far past reasonable limits. Papers are spread across desks like confetti left behind after a party that no one enjoyed. The reporters wear the expression of people who have spent too much time staring at documents that make less sense the longer they look at them. One waves you over, gesturing to a wall covered in notes, printouts, and red string, arranged with the chaotic enthusiasm of someone hoping clarity will appear if they squint hard enough. The first thread follows a manufacturer that insists it produces tear gas exclusively for domestic use. The reporter taps a photo of the company's headquarters, a nondescript building that looks like it should manufacture office furniture rather than chemical agents. According to the paperwork, the shipments go to nearby law enforcement agencies. Yet somehow, identical canisters keep turning up in countries located suspiciously far from the manufacturer's declared distribution zone. The reporter flips through customs records with the impatience of someone hunting for a punchline that stubbornly refuses to land. Another reporter approaches with a stack of shipping logs so dense you wonder whether the paper itself weighs more than the canisters ever did. He points out a supplier that routed materials through 3 separate countries, each with its own paperwork style and tendency to misplace documents. One form lists the contents as crowd dispersal devices. Another calls them training equipment. A third simply labels them miscellaneous hardware. He shrugs at the inconsistencies, saying it is like chasing a ghost who keeps changing outfits. You move to a desk where a journalist sits with her laptop open to a series of grainy photos taken at a port. She zooms in on a crate, bearing a shipping label that looks suspiciously smudged, as though the ink got cold feet mid-print. Next to the crate stands a worker holding a clipboard with a form that lists the contents as parts. No one seems sure what kind of parts they are supposed to be. The journalist scrolls through emails, exchanged between middlemen, who speak in vague phrases like expedited materials and specialty items, phrases that feel intentionally foggy. She sighs and rubs her temples, muttering that if this were a detective novel, the editor would have thrown out the plot in Chapter 2. Across the room, a reporter sits surrounded by open folders. He holds up a document showing a company that claims to have stopped producing tear gas years ago, only for investigators to find fresh canisters matching its distinctive markings in another country's inventory. He flips to a spreadsheet showing financial transactions, the amounts drifting across columns with no clear destination. He tries to explain the logic of these transactions, but halfway through his sentence he stops, reconsiders, and admits that the numbers behave like suspiciously talented escape artists. Another wall displays a colorful map tracing supply routes. The lines stretch across continents in loops, zigzags, and improbable detours that make you question whether the shipping coordinators plotted routes using darts and a rotating globe. Some shipments travel through regions with no direct ports. Others appear to teleport from one continent to another with the grace of plot holes in a low-budget crime show. A reporter gestures at the map and declares that if this were fiction, no one would believe it. You notice a cluster of reporters crowding around a fresh leak, an email chain between distributors discussing adjustments to paperwork. They read aloud parts that sound suspiciously like code. One mentions minimizing descriptors. Another recommends rerouting through a partner with flexible documentation. Someone else requests updated labels, preferably ones less likely to draw attention. The room fills with incredulous laughter that carries more disbelief than amusement. As the evening drags on, the reporters stitch together fragments of evidence, connecting clues that never quite settle into a coherent shape. They discover warehouse addresses that do not exist, companies with no employees, and supply contracts that renew automatically despite the listed companies having dissolved years prior. Every time they uncover a new lead, it splits into two more, each more confusing than the last. The supply chain sprawls out like a labyrinth designed by someone who resented straight lines. By nightfall, the newsroom glows with the light of monitors and tired determination. The reporters stand by their tangled web of documents, lines, and theories, trying to make sense of a supply chain that refuses to behave like anything rooted in reality. They keep piecing it together anyway, refusing to let the confusion win. You step back and take in the sight. The story they are building is not clean, elegant, or tidy. It is a messy trail of half-truths, loopholes, and evasions that reads less like a serious investigation and more like a detective plot written by someone who misplaced their outline. Yet somehow, it is all real. You walk through the glass doors of a research facility that looks modern on the outside, but carries the distinct interior energy of a place trying to convince everyone it knows exactly what it is doing. The lobby smells faintly of disinfectant and ambition. Posters line the walls, showing sleek illustrations of new chemical agents, with names that sound more like tech gadgets than substances meant to make people cry involuntarily. You follow a hallway humming with machinery until you reach a room where the real work takes place, if work is the right word for something happening this quickly. Engineers and chemists hover around tables covered with vials, canisters, and charts that do not seem to agree with one another. They speak in rapid, hushed tones, exchanging ideas that sound more like suggestions than conclusions. One scientist holds up a tiny vial of clear liquid and announces that this new formula disperses faster and evaporates sooner. A colleague nods without looking up, scribbling something on a clipboard as if checking a box labeled "probably fine." You notice no one mentions long-term effects. The room seems allergic to that subject. A researcher taps a page of lab results and explains that the new agent should cause less discomfort, though she cannot quite define less. She trails off mid-sentence, glancing at a colleague who offers an encouraging shrug, the universal gesture, for we hope so. Another scientist tosses a used glove into a disposal bin and mutters something about improved efficiency, which appears to mean the cloud spreads more predictably, at least in the controlled environment of a sealed chamber with no wind, people, or reality. You step closer to a workstation where a technician is assembling a prototype canister. He handles the metal shell with practiced ease, snapping components together with the speed of someone building furniture from memory, rather than instructions. He explains that the new formula requires slightly different dispersal mechanics, though no one has fully tested how it behaves when launched into actual air. He clicks the final piece into place and holds up the canister proudly. The confidence is impressive, considering the sum total of testing appears to be a handful of simulations and a small chamber where a mannequin sits silently, offering no feedback. At a nearby table, a marketing representative flips through color palettes for updated packaging. She talks animatedly about visual branding, emphasizing calming colors that convey safety and reliability. She never looks at the formula sheets beside her, though they contain more question marks than conclusions. A designer shows her a mock-up of an instruction manual filled with friendly diagrams and large reassuring text. He explains that customers respond well to clarity, even when the underlying product is still figuring itself out. The representative nods, circling a shade of soft blue to use on the labels. Further down the lab, two scientists hover near a whiteboard covered in formulas crossed out hastily. They debate whether switching one compound for another will reduce irritation or increase it. The conversation loops in circles, each suggestion answered with a tentative maybe. They add a new chemical name to the board, scribble a question mark beside it, then stare at the word as if waiting for it to reveal its personality. After a moment, one scientist erases the name entirely and replaces it with a different one. Problem solved, at least until the next round of uncertainty. In the corner, a small testing chamber releases a short puff of the new formula. The gas disperses in a clean, graceful cloud that looks almost elegant under the bright lights. A group of researchers applaud softly, as though watching a child's first steps. One of them checks a stopwatch and announces the dispersal rate is excellent. No one asks how it affects actual lungs. Someone writes promising in large letters on a clipboard, underlining it twice. You follow a hallway to a conference room, where executives sit around a polished table, reviewing reports delivered with the confidence of people who know how to read numbers but not always what they mean. They discuss production timelines, market rollout, and potential interest from agencies looking for updated tools. One executive raises a concern about limited testing. Another counters that demand is high, and competitors are moving fast. The conversation tilts quickly toward profit forecasts, supply chain logistics, and brand differentiation. Safety lingers in the room only as a distant, easily postponed guest. As you leave the facility, the sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. Behind you, technicians continue assembling canisters, researchers continue adjusting formulas, and marketers continue polishing narratives. Everything progresses swiftly, neatly, almost efficiently. Yet beneath the gleaming surfaces and confident presentations lies a quiet truth. The science is still catching up, and the formulas are already on their way out the door. You squeeze into the back of a crowded community center where folding chairs have been arranged in lopsided rows, as though the room itself knew this gathering was assembled last minute. Posters hang crooked on the walls, advertising free flu shots and neighborhood cleanup days, none of which quite match the energy of tonight's meeting. People of every age fill the room, bundled in scarves and jackets, clutching notebooks, water bottles, and the kind of determined expressions usually reserved for late-night study sessions before a major exam. You take a seat and feel the hum of urgency ripple through the group. At the front, a volunteer clears her throat and holds up a printed sheet that looks suspiciously like it was assembled with equal parts research, improvisation, and stubborn hope. She explains that tear gas has been used in nearby demonstrations, which means the community has decided to make its own guide for protection. The crowd leans forward. She begins with the basics, describing how gas spreads, how wind can betray even the best intentions, and how staying calm is vital, no matter how impossible it feels. Her voice trembles slightly but steadies with each sentence, gaining confidence from the rows of people listening with absolute focus. A man with a hoodie and a backpack steps up next, pulling out a stack of homemade pamphlets bound with staples that look like they were pushed in by hand. He demonstrates how to seal goggles with plastic wrap, how to fold a cloth mask just right, and how to create makeshift filters from common household items. He jokes quietly that no one expected these skills to become part of modern life, but here they are. The room chuckles softly, grateful for the small burst of humor in a heavy conversation. At a long table, a group of teens lay out supplies like they are preparing for an improvised science fair. They show how to rinse eyes safely, how to avoid spreading the chemicals by mistake, and how to help someone who is panicking. They move with surprising precision, passing each other vinegar, baking soda, and sealed bottles of saline. You watch them demonstrate techniques learned from online forums, old protest footage, and trial and error. Their hands move quickly as they teach others to fold bandanas and secure them with elastic bands. Even the younger kids watch intently, nodding along as though memorizing instructions for an upcoming test. In the corner, a retired nurse sits behind a table of medical supplies she bought herself. She calmly explains how tear gas affects the body, describing symptoms in simple terms that make the science feel approachable rather than frightening. She instructs people to breathe slowly, avoid rubbing their eyes, and help each other move away from the cloud without pushing. Her voice carries the gentle authority of someone who has spent a lifetime guiding others through chaos. When she finishes, people line up to ask questions, each one leaning in as though absorbing wisdom from a treasured elder. You drift toward another cluster where two volunteers are sketching diagrams on a whiteboard. Their drawings are uneven and cartoonish, but everyone gathers close to watch. They illustrate how wind direction can change in an instant, how alleys can trap gas, and how to move calmly through the haze. Someone adds arrows to show escape routes. Another adds stick figures wearing improvised masks. And soon the board becomes a cheerful, chaotic map of survival techniques. The volunteers step back, looking proud despite the uneven lines. A young woman begins explaining strategies for staying safe in crowds. She talks about linking arms, keeping an eye on one another, and choosing meeting points in case people get separated. She emphasizes communication and kindness, reminding everyone that calm, steady voices can sometimes cut through panic better than anything else. You watch the group absorb her words, nodding slowly, recognizing that what she is describing is not just a guide, but a way to take care of one another. As the evening goes on, the community center transforms into a buzzing hub of shared knowledge. Strangers trade phone numbers. Families gather extra pamphlets for neighbors who could not attend, and volunteers move table to table, checking that everyone understands the basics. There is laughter, nervousness, determination, and a subtle thread of solidarity weaving through every conversation. The guides are imperfect, the supplies are improvised, and the information shifts constantly. Yet, the people here treat every detail with deep seriousness. When the meeting finally winds down, you step outside into the cool night air, carrying a packet of homemade instructions that feels oddly precious. Around you, others walk home in small groups, clutching the same guides, talking softly, planning to share what they learned. You realize this gathering is not just about protection. It is about refusing to face uncertainty alone. You sit in the gallery of a government chamber that feels more like a museum than a place where decisions are meant to happen. The walls are lined with portraits of stern people from centuries ago, all of them staring down with an expression that suggests they expected progress to move faster too. The seats creak when anyone leans back, and the microphones emit a faint static hum, as if even the electronics are bored. You settle in, bracing yourself for the slow crawl that is about to unfold. A committee chair clears his throat with the solemnity of someone preparing to announce something monumental. Instead, he begins by reviewing the minutes from the previous meeting, which appear to involve approximately 3 sentences of actual movement and 12 paragraphs of procedural tangles. He reads each line carefully, pausing for nods that ripple through the room like polite waves at a sports event where no one knows the rules. You check the clock. It ticks loudly, unbothered by the lack of urgency. The first speaker steps up, holding a stack of papers that look heavier than his confidence. He begins a long explanation about the need to review tear gas regulations, emphasizing the importance of public safety, transparency, and accountability. He talks in circles, repeating phrases that sound important but land with the impact of soggy toast. By the time he finishes, the committee members nod thoughtfully, as if they have just been told a profound secret rather than a summary of concerns everyone already knew. Next, a representative from another party takes the microphone. She acknowledges the seriousness of the issue, then pivots into a 15-minute detour about process, subcommittees, and the need for additional studies. She suggests forming a task force, which prompts murmurs of approval from people who clearly enjoy the idea of task forces more than the idea of actual solutions. She proposes a timeline so vague it could apply to any decade. The chair nods, pleased with the suggestion, unaware that the audience has collectively aged several emotional years. A third speaker stands, bringing charts that he holds at an angle no one can see. He mentions budget constraints, legal complexities, and the difficulty of balancing public input with operational needs. He gestures toward the unseen charts, insisting the data is compelling. A member politely asks if they can view the information. The speaker coughs, says the charts are only in draft form, and promises to share them at a later meeting. He sits back down, having achieved nothing other than adding another item to an already bloated agenda. Hours pass. You watch lawmakers debate amendments that seem to exist solely to create more debating. Someone proposes a revision to a definition. Someone else objects on the grounds that the revision is too specific. Another objects that it is not specific enough. The chair suggests tabling the discussion until the next session, at which point half the room sighs in relief and the other half sighs in frustration. A single sentence of progress is added to the official record. It feels like a milestone only because so little else has happened. A representative presents testimony from medical experts. He reads it aloud in a monotone voice that strips the urgency from each line, flattening serious concerns into something resembling bedtime stories for bureaucrats. Committee members nod gravely, promise to consider the information, and then immediately pivot into procedural disputes about scheduling future hearings. One member suggests reviewing international guidelines for comparison. Another recommends postponing that review until they have reviewed the guidelines on reviewing guidelines. You feel your spirit momentarily leave your body in search of momentum. By late afternoon, the chamber has settled into a rhythm so slow it feels like observing geological change. The chair proposes reconvening next month. A few members argue that next month is too soon. Others argue it is too late. They compromise on a date that satisfies no one but fits neatly into the calendar of delays. Papers shuffle, pens cap. Microphones switch off one by one, their clicks echoing like tiny farewell taps. As the committee dismisses, officials drift out of the room with the relaxed pace of people who feel they accomplished something meaningful, even if the only thing achieved was more scheduling. You walk into the hallway alongside them, watching their casual conversations about lunch plans and upcoming holidays. It is as though the topic that filled the chamber all day has already dissolved into the background noise of a bureaucracy comfortable with its own inertia. Outside, the world moves on, brisk and unpredictable, shaped by forces that do not wait for committees to agree. You stand for a moment on the steps, feeling the contrast between the urgency of the problem and the glacial pace of the process. The turtle may be sleepy, you think, but at least the turtle is moving. The system, however, seems content to nap. You find yourself in a meeting room that feels like it was borrowed from a community center that has seen one too many talent shows. The carpet is slightly lopsided. The fluorescent lights flicker in a way that suggests they are providing illumination, strictly out of obligation, and a large poster at the front reads, "Brainstorming session," in bold letters that look far more confident than anyone in the room feels. A dozen officials, experts, and volunteers sit in a circle with clipboards and coffee cups, their faces carrying the unmistakable expression of people who have been told to come up with alternatives to tear gas and are now discovering how difficult that actually is. The chairperson begins with a hopeful smile, announcing that the goal is to find humane, effective methods for crowd control. The room nods in collective optimism. Then someone suggests using bright lights to disorient crowds, which sounds feasible, until another expert points out that crowds might simply turn away, put on sunglasses, or become mildly irritated instead of dispersing. The group hums thoughtfully, as though imagining a future where a crowd politely leaves because someone switched on a high-powered lamp. A researcher proposes using sound waves at specific frequencies to encourage people to move. She mentions studies showing that certain tones can be uncomfortable without causing harm. She phrases it carefully, but the room collectively winces as they imagine entire streets filled with people fleeing the world's most annoying ringtone. The chairperson thanks her and writes it down anyway, perhaps out of politeness or desperation. A different participant stands, clearing his throat dramatically before suggesting scented fog. He explains that certain smells are naturally repellent. He lists examples like spoiled milk, rotten fruit, and something involving a sulfur compound that makes even the air seem offended. The crowd stares at him, caught between amusement and horror. Someone quietly asks whether the smell would linger on clothing. Another wonders how long the scent would take to dissipate. A third, more practical voice notes that deliberately making a city smell like a broken refrigerator might create more complaints than it solves. The idea is gently placed on the maybe later pile. Across the room, an engineer with wild hair that sticks out like static electricity announces an idea with the enthusiasm of someone who had it 15 minutes after midnight and drew it on a napkin. He suggests deploying harmless but slippery foam. He gestures excitedly as he describes how it would make crowds too unstable to move aggressively. The room imagines hundreds of people trying not to fall, slipping around like newborn deer on ice. One expert points out liability concerns. Another adds that medical resources would be overwhelmed by bruised elbows and sprained ankles. A third wonders aloud how anyone would clean the foam afterward. The engineer nods, already sketching improvements in the margins of his notes. A psychologist raises her hand and suggests verbal de-escalation through large speaker systems, projecting calming messages. The room leans in with interest until she demonstrates the sort of soothing tone required, a voice so gentle it sounds like a bedtime story for anxious adults. The idea carries promise, but then someone reminds the room that loudspeakers tend to crackle, distort, and screech unexpectedly. The psychologist sighs, acknowledging the unpredictable nature of public audio equipment. Then, as the meeting drifts toward late afternoon drowsiness, someone offers an idea so bizarre it instantly awakens the entire group. He proposes using oversized inflatable barriers that slowly rise between officers and crowds like cautious, rubbery walls. He proudly explains that the barriers could nudge people backward without harming anyone. The room is silent for a moment as everyone pictures massive inflatable cushions expanding in the middle of a tense street. Someone finally breaks the silence to ask whether the barriers could be punctured. Another wonders what would happen in windy conditions. A third asks if they would simply roll away like runaway parade balloons. The proposer admits he has not considered these details, but insists the concept has heart. By the time the meeting winds down, the whiteboard is filled with suggestions ranging from mildly sensible to wildly experimental. The participants gather their notes with equal parts pride and confusion, unsure whether they have made progress or simply proven that brainstorming is a deeply unpredictable art form. The chairperson commends their creativity, though the look in her eyes suggests she understands the challenge ahead. You step outside as the sun dips low, feeling oddly comforted. The ideas may be chaotic, impractical, or downright strange, but they share one quiet truth. People are trying to imagine something better, even if the path there is covered in scented fog and inflatable barriers. You find yourself moving through a series of government halls in different countries, each with its own personality, each promising something bold and principled, and each ultimately behaving like someone trying to keep a New Year resolution after a single enthusiastic morning jog. One nation announces a ban with the dramatic flair of a stage actor taking a final bow, declaring that tear gas has no place in civil life. The press applauds, officials beam, and for a moment the air feels lighter, almost hopeful. You watch the ceremony from the front row, feeling the strange thrill of witnessing a rare moment of collective will. But as weeks pass, the bright promise begins to fade. The ban is put under review because certain departments complain about operational challenges. Someone claims the ban was rushed. Someone else insists the definition of tear gas needs to be clarified. Committees spring up like stubborn weeds, each tasked with evaluating aspects of the ban that had seemed straightforward only a month earlier. You sit through hearings where officials debate phrasing as if adjusting a single word might unlock the secrets of the universe. Soon the ban is paused, pending further study, and then paused again for reasons no one can quite explain. By the end of the year, it is not gone, not present, simply suspended in a bureaucratic limbo that feels carefully engineered to avoid responsibility. In another country, the approach is quieter but more earnest. Leaders discuss the ban with genuine concern, and for a while, it appears to take hold with surprising strength. Police training programs begin exploring alternatives, civil groups are consulted, and advisors claim the nation is stepping toward a more humane model. You feel cautiously encouraged as you watch officers practice de-escalation techniques and experiment with tools designed to create distance rather than pain. The progress seems real, even promising. Then an election arrives, sweeping in new officials who view the ban as a misguided obstacle rather than an achievement. Within weeks, they announce revisions, then exceptions, then pilot programs. You witness language you did not even know existed, the sort crafted to sound reasonable while undoing entire policies. By the time the dust settles, the ban exists only in the margins of law, a relic of the previous administration's idealism. The public protests, activists shout, experts testify, but the shift continues like a slow tide, steady and unbothered by raised voices. In a different corner of the world, a government introduces a partial ban that resembles a compromise between principle and practicality. Tear gas is prohibited for peaceful gatherings, but permitted for riots. This sounds sensible until officials attempt to define peaceful and riot in ways that change depending on the hour. One day the ban seems active. The next day it appears conditional. You watch judges interpret the law differently from officers, and officers interpret it differently from commanders, until the entire policy becomes a choose-your-own-adventure book where every path leads to confusion. Some nations handle the issue with surprising creativity. They trial community-based solutions, host forums, and attempt models borrowed from other countries. But as you travel from one capital to another, you notice the same pattern. Bold announcements, hopeful beginnings, logistical hurdles, political pressure, gradual erosion. It plays out like a well-rehearsed routine repeated on different stages, always with slight variations but unmistakably familiar. Even in places where bans remain mostly intact, they exist in a constant state of vulnerability, a shift in public mood, a high-profile protest, a sudden surge of fear, and the debate begins anew. Officials cite security concerns. Experts are brought in to testify again. Headlines speculate. Laws that once seemed stable tremble under the weight of competing interests. You watch each government wobble between ideals and anxieties, trying to balance safety with control, public trust with institutional caution. Through all of this, you see something else too. The bans, flawed as they are, spark conversations. They force questions. They push people to imagine alternatives. They may falter, bend, or dissolve. But each attempt leaves behind a trace of possibility, a faint outline that the next generation might pick up and strengthen. As you step back from the swirl of policies and politics, You realize the story is not about bands succeeding or failing, but about how hard it is for societies to change the tools they grew accustomed to, and how every effort, even the unsteady ones, nudges the world a little closer to reconsidering what force should look like. You return to the old battlefields with the uneasy feeling that you have walked in a giant circle. The trenches are gone now, swallowed by grass and time, but the air still feels heavy in a way that memory alone cannot explain. You step through rolling fields once carved into mud and misery, imagining the soldiers who crouched here a century ago, blinking through clouds of burning fumes, wondering who thought any of it was a good idea. Birds call overhead, blissfully unaware of the history beneath their wings, and you feel the strange dissonance of peace resting on top of chaos that never fully left. A guide walks beside you, explaining how early chemists had insisted they were creating deterrents, not weapons, as if that distinction made the blinding, choking clouds any more pleasant. You picture them hunched over laboratory beakers, arguing in polite tones while stirring mixtures that would soon roll across entire fields of terrified men. The guide speaks with the calm cadence of someone who believes explanation alone can soften what happened here, but nothing really softens it. You can still sense the frantic scrambling, the shouted orders, the grim attempts to adapt to something no one understood. You wander toward a reconstructed trench, its wooden supports slightly too clean, its sandbags too symmetrical. Still, the enclosed space presses in around you, and you can almost hear the clatter of boots and the rasp of breath behind gas-soaked cloth. You imagine a soldier fumbling with a mask that fogs instantly, eyes watering so badly he cannot see his hands. You imagine another soldier choking on fumes that sting more sharply than anything he had ever imagined. You imagine commanders shouting commands that contradict one another, trying to guess which way the wind might turn. The wind, then and now, remains the true wild card. It has the same stubborn personality it always had. As you walk along a ridge, a breeze pushes against your face, and you remember the stories of gas drifting back across friendly lines with an almost spiteful sense of humor. Commanders would plan elaborate offensives, release canisters with the confidence of men certain they had found a tactical edge, only to watch clouds swirl around like confused spirits and roll directly toward them. You imagine the panic, the scramble, the sudden realization that the weapon designed for control had no intention of obeying. As you linger, it becomes clear why governments later agreed that such substances had no place in war. The battlefield made their cruelty impossible to ignore. You picture diplomats sitting in rooms far from the mud, discussing humanitarian principles over strong coffee, while the memory of gas haunted every argument. They banned it because they could see the suffering clearly. And yet, as you shift your attention from the past to the present, something unsettling emerges. You recognize the echoes. The arguments shift in wording, not in structure. The justifications evolve, not the substance beneath them. Officials today still talk about necessity, about exceptional circumstances, about tools that offer control without lasting harm. You watch these rationalizations unfold in your mind like faded copies of earlier explanations, altered by time, but unmistakably familiar. Even the winds of public opinion move like their battlefield counterpart, shifting suddenly, reversing direction, catching entire institutions by surprise. You see how quickly modern clouds of gas can drift into unintended places, how easily streets can mimic old trenches in confusion, how the past keeps nudging the present and whispering that it has seen all this before. You stand at the crest of the hill and look out across the field, where sunlight paints everything gold. The quiet feels too gentle for what happened here, yet history rests beneath it like a foundation poured from all the choices and missteps that came before. You realize you are not just revisiting old ground, you are witnessing the looping path of a story that never quite lets go. The battlefield may be silent now, but its lessons echo louder than any shell that ever landed here. You step into a present-day city that hums with the familiar mix of honking cars, impatient footsteps, and the faint aroma of street food drifting through the air. At first glance, everything looks ordinary, almost comfortingly so. People hurry toward buses. Someone jogs with a level of confidence that suggests they enjoy running, and a group of teenagers laughs loudly about something on a cracked phone screen. Yet, as you walk deeper into the center, you can sense something else woven through the rhythm of daily life, something quieter but unmistakably tense. You notice surveillance cameras perched on lampposts, their lenses catching slivers of sunlight as they rotate. You see barriers stacked neatly outside a government building, waiting for someone to decide whether today will be peaceful or not. The city feels like it has prepared for two very different afternoons, one calm and one chaotic, and it is holding its breath while waiting to see which one arrives. The tension becomes clearer when you turn onto a street where people have started gathering for a demonstration. Handmade signs bob gently above the crowd. Some slogans are written neatly in careful lettering, while others look like they were scribbled in a rush, the ink still smudged at the corners. You stand among them, feeling the energy build like rising steam from asphalt after rain. People chant, people clap, people hold hands, and for a brief moment the air feels charged with hope, the kind that makes your chest lift a little higher. Then you notice the officers. They stand in a line at the far end of the street, their gear polished, their stances rigid, their faces mostly unreadable behind visors. You have seen photographs like this before, but being here adds a weight that pictures never capture. Their belts hold canisters the color of storm clouds, and you recognize the shapes instantly. It hits you how strange it is that a substance considered too cruel for battlefields sits here in the middle of a city whose loudest conflict an hour ago was probably a parking argument. The crowd notices too. Conversations falter. A few people shift their posture, not quite stepping back but adjusting their center of gravity in that instinctive way humans do when they sense the rules of the space beginning to change. The officers murmur to one another, gestures small but coordinated. You can almost hear the decision-making process, the long chain of protocols that carry a quiet question. Is today the kind of day where tear gas becomes part of the story? The thought alone changes the atmosphere. You listen as someone near you explains the best way to move if things turn chaotic. Another person hands out simple, protective items made from supplies they bought at a hardware store. A parent lifts their child onto their shoulders, trying to keep them away from the growing crush of bodies. You realize that for many people here, this is not a hypothetical fear, but a familiar rhythm, something that has become as routine as bad weather. When the first line of shouting erupts, it is hard to tell where it begins. A few people surge forward. Officers tighten their formation. Someone in the back pushes accidentally, then apologizes loudly. The tension cracks open in an instant, sprawling outward through the crowd like spilled ink. The officers advance a step, shields rising with the slow inevitability of a tide. You hear the metallic clink of a canister being handled, and the sound alone sends a ripple through the people around you. In that moment, the entire city holds two futures at once, one where the crowd disperses on its own, frustration sweeping out like wind, and one where a small metal cylinder arcs through the air and lands with a hollow thud that everyone recognizes, filling the street with burning air that makes people stumble blindly. You watch the officers decide, their shoulders shifting in a nearly imperceptible signal, their hands hovering but not gripping. Today, in this moment, the canisters stay where they are. Officers lower their arms just slightly, as though exhaling tension. The crowd, sensing the shift, gradually steadies itself. Chants resume. Signs rise again. The street reclaims its voice. You stand still for a long time afterward, realizing how much of modern civic life is shaped not by dramatic events, but by the possibility of them. Tear gas lingers here even when unused. It shapes behavior, expectations, fears, and choices. It hangs over public squares like an unspoken rule, altering how people gather and how they imagine their own power. You walk on as the city returns to normal, though the word normal now feels more complicated than before. You stand at the edge of a quiet overlook, staring out at a city that stretches toward the horizon in soft evening light. Buildings glow faintly as street lamps flicker on one by one, and the sky melts from blue to violet in slow, unhurried layers. It feels like a moment suspended in time, a pause long enough for you to imagine futures that have not been written yet. The world seems peaceful from up here, but you know that peace is fragile, shaped by choices and tools that people created long before this moment. You think about tear gas, about everything you have seen and followed and walked through. The laboratory beakers, the battlefield clouds, the polished canisters tucked into modern belts. You think about the strange contradiction of a substance so harsh that nations banned it from war, yet so common that cities stock it beside their traffic cones. As you look out over the rooftops, you begin to wonder if something different could exist in the space where fear and force have lived for so long. When you imagine a world without tear gas, the first thing you notice is not the absence of smoke, it is the presence of something else. Streets where protests breathe instead of choke. Conversations where officials do not begin planning with worst-case scenarios, but with empathy and creativity. Officers trained to navigate conflict with tools that encourage movement rather than panic. Crowds that do not flinch when a line of uniforms appears. The possibility feels strange at first, almost too gentle to be realistic. But the longer you sit with it, the more it settles into something that feels worth considering. You imagine neighborhoods where communities and authorities meet long before tensions erupt, where people actually know each other's names instead of shouting them across barricades. Some cities have tried this already in small doses, and while no one claims it solves everything, you have seen moments where communication softens what force would only inflame. Those moments flicker in your memory like tiny lanterns lighting a path through uncertainty. Of course, another part of you knows the world does not shift just because someone imagines it. There will always be officials arguing that removing a tool makes their job impossible. There will be those who believe crowds cannot be trusted, that danger hides in every gathering, that fear is a reasonable foundation for policy. You have watched these debates play out too many times to underestimate their weight. Fear has a way of wrapping itself in practicality, and practicality has a way of sounding authoritative even when it is simply scared. Still, as you look at the city, you can see the future branching like delicate cracks in glass. Some paths are barely visible, some glow with clarity, some loop back on themselves. You trace the one where research continues, where new tools are tested with genuine caution, where data replaces assumptions and harm is measured honestly. You trace another path where global agreements grow stronger instead of weaker, where nations finally update rules written in completely different eras. You even trace the path where tear gas remains for a while longer, but loses its place as the default answer to fear. The future does not seem like a single destination. It seems like a collection of possibilities, each shaped by decisions, small and large. And you realize something unexpected. The question is not whether a world without tear gas is possible. The question is whether people will choose the work required to build it. Not just the dramatic decisions, but the quiet ones. The ones made in offices, in training rooms, in late-night meetings, in city halls, in conversations between neighbors. As the lights in the city brighten, you picture someone decades from now, standing where you stand, wondering how the world ever relied on something so violent in the first place. You imagine them reading about tear gas in the same tone people now use when describing ancient medical practices that involved leeches and wishful thinking. You imagine their disbelief, their relief, their distance from it. For now, the air around you is clear, cool, and still. You breathe it in and let it out slowly. Somewhere far below, a siren wails and then quiets again. Life continues, full of worry and hope and flaws and possibility. The future remains unwritten, and you understand that hope is not a promise, but it is a beginning.